Close your eyes and let your breathing slow. Imagine a world so old that no human eye has ever seen it. A world that existed long before the first city, before the first written word, before the first footprint was ever pressed into wet sand by anything resembling a person. Tonight we're going to travel there together. Not in a hurry, not with any sense of urgency, but gently, the way you might drift down a slow river in the warm dark. We're going back more than 250 million years, to a time when the dinosaurs did not yet exist, to discover how they truly came to be. So settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let me carry you backward through the long, quiet corridors of deep time. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Now let us begin where the real story begins, which is not with the dinosaurs at all, but with the strange and ancient world that came before them. Picture a single great landmass, vast beyond imagining, stretching from the top of the world to the bottom of it. There are no separate continents here, no familiar shapes of land that you would recognize from any map. There is only one enormous body of Earth, one supercontinent, and scientists have given it a name that means all land. They call it Pangaea. If you could rise up high above this ancient world and look down upon it, you would see one great mass of land surrounded by one great ocean, a single endless sea that wrapped around the whole of the planet like a deep blue blanket. This was the world as it existed roughly 250 million years ago, in a span of time that geologists call the late Permian period. And it was a world utterly unlike our own. There were no birds singing in the trees, because there were no birds. There were no flowers opening their petals to the sun, because flowers had not yet evolved. There was no grass softening the ground beneath your feet, because grass too belonged to a future that was still tens of millions of years away. Instead, the land was covered in older, stranger plants. There were seed ferns with their delicate forked leaves, and there were early conifers, ancestors of the pine trees we know today, and there were tall horsetails and primitive growths that hugged the edges of the rivers and the shores. The interior of this supercontinent was a place of extremes. Because the landmass was so enormous, moisture carried in from the surrounding ocean could only travel so far before it fell as rain. By the time the air reached the deep heart of the continent, it had long since given up its water, and so the interior was a vast, dry, baking desert. Imagine a wasteland larger than any desert that exists on Earth today, stretching for thousands of miles in every direction, where the sun rose each morning over red rock and cracked earth, and where almost nothing could survive. The temperatures in this dead centre of the world swung wildly, scorching by day and bitterly cold by night, because there was no great body of water nearby to soften the swings and gentle the air. Life, then, did not gather in the centre. Life gathered at the edges, along the coastlines where the ocean breathed its moisture onto the land, and in the scattered river valleys where water still flowed. The living things of this ancient world made their homes, and what living things they were. For the rulers of this world were not the dinosaurs who did not yet exist, and they were not mammals, who were still little more than a faint promise written in the future. The rulers of the late Permian world were creatures called synapsids, and they are some of the most fascinating animals that ever lived. You may have heard them called mammal-like reptiles, though that name does not quite capture what they truly were. They were their own kind of creature, a separate branch on the great tree of life, animals that had been evolving along their own path for tens of millions of years. Some of them were enormous. They were bulky plant-eaters the size of modern hippopotamuses, with thick, heavy skulls and stout bodies built to endure the harshness of their world. They spent their days grazing slowly on the tough, primitive plants near the water, never wandering far from the moisture they needed to live. And there were hunters, too. There were predators with long, curved teeth like daggers, animals with powerful jaws and a hungry patience, who stalked the coastlines and the riverbanks where their prey came to drink. Some of these predators grew to 10 feet in length or more. They had features that, if you looked closely, might remind you faintly of mammals. Perhaps they had whiskers. Perhaps they had the very beginnings of fur. Their teeth were not all the same, the way a lizard's teeth are, but were shaped for different purposes, some for grasping and some for slicing. And yet they were not mammals. They were something older, something that belonged entirely to this lost world. This was a planet that had already lived through a great deal. The synapsids that ruled it were themselves survivors, the descendants of creatures who had endured hardships we will come to in time. But for now, for this long quiet moment in the deep past, the world of the late Permian was stable in its own harsh way. The seasons turned. The great monsoons swept in from the ocean during the warm months, dumping their rains upon the coasts before retreating again. The rivers swelled and shrank. The synapsids hunted and grazed and raised their young. The strange forests grew and faded with the rhythm of the year. It was not a gentle world, but it was a world that worked, a world that had found its own difficult balance. And the ocean that surrounded it all was a wonder in itself. It was the largest single body of water that has ever existed on our planet, a vast and rolling sea that covered the greater part of the world's surface. Geologists call it Panther Lassa, a name that means all seas, and that is exactly what it was. One unbroken ocean, stretching from pole to pole, interrupted only by the great mass of Pangaea. Without continents to break apart the patterns of the waves and the currents, this ocean moved in ways that no modern sea can match. Storms could build across thousands of miles of open water. Currents wrapped around the whole of the globe, carrying warmth from the equator toward the poles, and cold water back again along the dark ocean floor. Beneath the surface of that great sea swam creatures that have long since vanished from the earth. There were ancient fish, and there were strange shelled animals, and there were coral reefs that stretched for hundreds of miles, built up patiently over countless generations. There were trilobites, those armoured creatures that had crawled across the seafloors of the world for more than 250 million years, longer than almost any other group of animals in the entire history of life. They had survived disaster after disaster. They had endured through ages that had wiped away other creatures entirely. They seemed, perhaps, eternal. But nothing in this story is eternal, and that is part of what makes it so beautiful. For this whole world, this entire careful balance of synapsids and seed ferns and trilobites and shelled seas, was about to face the greatest test that life on Earth has ever known. The stage was set. The actors were in their places. The supercontinent baked under its ancient sun, and the great ocean rolled against its shores, and the synapsids raised their young in the river valleys, and not one of them had any way of knowing that their entire world stood at the very edge of catastrophe. But we will not rush toward that catastrophe tonight. We will let it come slowly, the way all things come in deep time, gradually and without alarm. For now, simply hold this image in your mind as you rest. One great land, one great sea, a world of strange and ancient life, turning quietly beneath the stars 250 million years before any human would ever walk upon it. Let that ancient world cradle you for a moment. Breathe in slowly and breathe out, and let us drift onward to what came next. To understand how the dinosaurs came to rule the earth, we must first understand how the world that came before them was very nearly erased entirely. For the story of the dinosaurs does not begin with their birth, it begins with an ending. It begins with the closest that life on this planet has ever come to disappearing altogether. And though this is a story of catastrophe, I want you to remember as you listen that you already know how it ends. Life survived. It always survived. So let your mind rest easy even as we walk through the darkest chapter of the ancient world, because there is no danger here, only a story being told softly in the dark. Around 252 million years ago, in the far north of the supercontinent, in the region that would one day become Siberia, the Earth itself began to break open. Deep beneath the crust, in the hot churning rock of the planet's mantle, immense pressures had been building for ages, and at last they found their release. The ground cracked, and from those cracks came not the neat cone-shaped volcanoes you might picture, but something far stranger and far more vast. Molten rock began to pour out across the land in enormous flowing sheets, rising up through great fissures and spreading across the countryside in waves of liquid fire. This was not a single eruption. It was not even a single volcano. It was a phenomenon that geologists call a flood basalt eruption, and it would continue on and off for the better part of 2 million years. Imagine flows of lava covering an area as large as a whole continent. Not all at once, but wave after wave, eruption after eruption, each one laying down another layer of molten stone upon the last. Over those long ages, the total volume of lava that poured out of the earth was almost beyond comprehension. There was enough of it to bury the entire surface of the planet beneath a layer many meters deep. It did not spread evenly, of course. Instead, it piled up in that northern region, building a vast plateau of stacked stone that geologists today call the Siberian Traps, where in places the layered lava reaches kilometers in thickness. But here is the strange and important truth. The lava itself was not the true danger. Lava, even in such tremendous quantities, destroys only what it directly touches. It is a local disaster, terrible for the land it covers, but survivable for life elsewhere. No, the true danger was invisible. The true danger was in the gases that came rising up out of the earth alongside the molten rock. With every eruption, the planet exhaled enormous quantities of volcanic gas into the sky. Carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, methane. A whole toxic mixture of substances that had been locked away deep in the earth and were now being released into the atmosphere in volumes that staggered the imagination. A single great pulse of these eruptions likely released more greenhouse gas into the air than all of human industry has produced in all of our history. And these eruptions did not happen once. They happened again and again, across 2 million years. And so the carbon dioxide began to build in the atmosphere, and as it built, it did what carbon dioxide does. It trapped the heat of the sun. The world began to warm. At first the warming was slow, a few degrees, a gradual creeping rise, but it did not stop. The planet grew warmer, and warmer still, until eventually the whole Earth was many degrees hotter than it had been before the eruptions began. And a warmer world is not simply a more comfortable world. A warmer world is a world thrown out of balance. Near the equator, the temperatures climbed so high that the heat became lethal. The tropical regions, which had once been among the most full of life anywhere on the planet, became dead zones where almost nothing could endure. The animals fled toward the cooler poles if they could. The plants simply withered and died where they stood. And the warming was only the beginning. The sulfur that the volcanoes had hurled into the sky combined with the moisture in the air, and it came back down as acid rain. Not occasionally, not in isolated storms, but steadily, across vast stretches of the world for ages at a time. This acid rain was strong enough to dissolve stone and to poison the soil. The forests that had clung to the coastlines began to die as the acid burned their leaves and seeped into their roots. The land that had been green grew grey and barren, and the soil itself turned toxic, so that even when the rain at last let up, little could grow there. The ocean suffered too, and in some ways they suffered worst of all. The seas absorbed a great deal of the carbon dioxide from the air, which might sound as though it should have helped. But as the carbon dioxide dissolved into the water, it made the water more acidic, and the creatures of the sea who built their shells and their skeletons from the minerals of the ocean found those minerals harder and harder to come by. The coral reefs, those great patient structures built over uncounted generations, began to dissolve. The shelled animals could no longer form their protective coverings. The very foundation of life in the sea began to crumble. And then came perhaps the cruelest blow of all. As the oceans warmed, they lost their ability to hold oxygen. Cold water can hold a great deal of dissolved oxygen, the breath of life for the creatures of the sea, but warm water holds far less. And so, as the world heated, the oceans began to suffocate. The deep waters went first, far down in the dark where the sunlight never reached. The creatures there died quietly, in the blackness, as the water that had sustained them for hundreds of millions of years turned lifeless and still. And then the dead zones spread. They crept upward and outward, rising toward the surface and reaching toward the shores, until even the shallow sunlit waters where most sea life dwelled began to lose their breath. The extinction, when it came, did not arrive all at once. It began gradually, a species here and a species there fading from the world, populations dwindling, the diversity of life slowly thinning. But the pressures kept building, the heat and the acid and the suffocation all pressing down together, until at last the slow decline became a sudden collapse. In the oceans, the devastation was almost total. Within a span of time that, in geological terms, was little more than a heartbeat, the great majority of all marine species vanished forever. The trilobites, those armoured survivors who had endured for more than 250 million years, who had outlasted disaster after disaster, finally met an end they could not escape. Every last one of them disappeared, and they would never return. Whole lineages of ancient fish that had ruled the seas for 100 million years simply ceased to be. The coral reefs dissolved away into the acid waters, leaving behind nothing but bare sediment. On the land, the destruction was only a little less complete. The great majority of land-dwelling animals went extinct. The forests died. The dominant synapsids, those mammal-like creatures who had ruled the world, were very nearly wiped from existence. A few scattered lineages clung on in whatever sheltered refuges they could find, but their long age of dominance was over. Even the insects, who are usually so resilient, so quick to recover, so difficult to kill in any great numbers, suffered terribly. This is the only mass extinction in all of Earth's history in which the insects took such a heavy blow. It takes something truly apocalyptic to push the insects to the brink, and this catastrophe did exactly that. If you could have walked across the world in those darkest days, you would have seen a planet in mourning. The land would have stretched out grey and lifeless, the dead trees standing like bones against a hazy sky. The soil beneath your feet would have been barren and poisoned. The rivers would have run thick with mud, no longer held in place by the roots of living plants, washing away the land that had been stable for ages. The sky itself would have been dimmed by a perpetual haze of volcanic ash, so that even at midday the light was strange and weak, a kind of endless twilight. And if you had walked down to the shores of the sea, the smell would have reached you first, the rotten egg stench of a dying ocean, and you would have looked out upon waters that were murky and still, where no fish broke the surface and no living thing stirred. This was the world at its very worst. This was the closest that complex life has ever come to vanishing entirely from the earth. Scientists who study this ancient catastrophe have given it a name that captures its enormity. They call it the Great Dying, and by some estimates, the total weight of all living things on the planet, every animal and every plant and every creature in the sea, fell by 90% or more. The world was dying. But, and here is the heart of it, the world did not die. It came terrifyingly close. It came closer than it has ever come before or since, but life did not end. In a few scattered refuges, in the cooler regions near the poles, in coastal corners where the ocean current still carried a little oxygen, in isolated valleys where some local mercy of geography kept conditions just barely livable, life held on. A handful of reptile species survived. A few amphibians made it through. A small number of synapsid lineages clung to existence by the thinnest of margins, and in the sea a scattering of fish and shelled creatures and marine reptiles endured. These survivors were not living well. They were barely living at all, holding on through sheer stubbornness, while the world burned and drowned and suffocated around them. They watched, if creatures can be said to watch, as the overwhelming majority of all the life they had ever known disappeared. But they were alive, and that, in the end, is all that life ever needs. A few survivors, a little diversity of form, and time. Given those three things, life will always find its way forward again. Slowly, ever so slowly, the eruptions in the far north began to quiet. The cracks in the earth began to close. The flood of lava slowed to a trickle, and then ceased. The poison stopped pouring into the sky, and the planet, exhausted and transformed, began at last to stabilize. It did not return to what it had been. It settled instead into a new and difficult balance, a world that was hotter than before, with oceans still struggling to recover their breath, and soil still scarred and ecosystems stripped down to their barest bones. But it was stable. It was a place where life, the life that had survived, could begin once more the slow, patient work of recovery. And this is where our story truly turns toward the dinosaurs, because the world that emerged from the Great Dying was a world of empty spaces. So many creatures had vanished that countless roles in the great web of life now stood unfilled. There were no longer dominant predators ruling the land, for they had mostly perished. There were no longer vast herds of grazing giants, for they too were gone. The world was wide open, swept nearly clean, waiting to be filled again by whatever survivors could adapt and multiply and spread. The stage had been cleared for something new, and though no creature alive in those days could have known it, the long, slow road that led to the age of dinosaurs had just begun. So rest now, and let this thought comfort you as you drift. Even after the worst catastrophe the world has ever known, life endured. It always endures, and from the ashes of that ancient ending, something extraordinary was about to begin. When a forest burns, the ground does not stay black for long. In time, the green returns, first in small tentative shoots, and then in a rush, until at last the land is alive again, though never quite the same as it was before. So it was with the whole of the world after the Great Dying. The recovery did not happen overnight. In fact, it took a very long time indeed, far longer than the recovery from any other extinction in Earth's history. For several million years, the planet remained a difficult and impoverished place, and the survivors eked out their existence in a world still healing from its wounds. This long span of recovery falls within a period of time that geologists call the Triassic, and it is one of the most important chapters in the entire story of life. For the Triassic was the cradle of the dinosaurs. It was the age in which they first appeared, the age in which they were shaped, the age that prepared the way for everything that followed. But the dinosaurs did not come first. In the early Triassic, the world belonged to others, and we must meet those others before we can understand the dinosaurs at all. In the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe, the most successful land animal was a creature called Lystrosaurus, and it is worth pausing on this remarkable survivor because its story tells us so much about how life recovers from disaster. Lystrosaurus was a synapsod, a relative of those mammal-like creatures who had ruled the late Permian world. It was a stout, barrel-bodied animal, roughly the size of a pig, with a strange beaked face and two small tusks jutting down from its upper jaw. It was not beautiful by most measures, it was not fierce, it was not particularly clever, but it was tough, and it was adaptable, and it could survive on the meagre resources of a ruined world. For a time, in the early Triassic, Lystrosaurus was almost unbelievably abundant. Across the recovering landscapes of the supercontinent, in region after region, the fossil record from this period is dominated by the bones of this single humble creature. By some estimates, the great majority of all the large land animals on Earth in those days were Lystrosaurus. Imagine a world so swept clean by catastrophe that a single kind of animal could spread across nearly the whole of it, filling the empty spaces left by all the creatures that had died. It is a strange and almost lonely image, this one stubborn beast inheriting a broken world. But it is also a hopeful one, for it shows us how life seizes its chances, how the survivors multiply and spread and begin to rebuild. But Lystrosaurus would not rule for long. As the world recovered and the ecosystems grew more complex, new kinds of animals began to rise, and among them was a group that would come to dominate the Triassic, in a way that no other creatures could match. These were the archosaurs, and the name they have been given means the ruling reptiles. And rule they did. The archosaurs are one of the most important groups in this whole story, because the dinosaurs themselves would eventually emerge from among them. But in the early and middle Triassic, the dinosaurs had not yet appeared, and the archosaurs took many other forms. To understand the archosaurs, you must imagine a great branching family tree, a tree that would in time split into two mighty limbs. One of those limbs would lead eventually to the crocodiles of today, the other would lead to the dinosaurs, and through the dinosaurs all the way down to the birds that sing outside your window. But in the Triassic, both of these limbs were still young, and they grew alongside each other, and for a long time it was the crocodile side of the family that held the upper hand. The early relatives of the crocodiles in the Triassic were nothing like the crocodiles you know. They did not lurk in rivers waiting to ambush prey. Many of them walked on land, and some of them walked tall, with their legs held directly beneath their bodies, striding across the landscape with surprising grace. There were great predators among them, fearsome hunters with long jaws full of teeth, some of them as large as the largest land predators that have ever lived. There were animals built like armoured tanks, heavily plated herbivores that lumbered slowly through the undergrowth, protected by bony armour that ran the length of their bodies. There was extraordinary variety among these creatures, an entire flourishing of forms, and for many millions of years they were the masters of the land. Alongside them, the descendants of the synapsids continued to live and evolve, though they no longer ruled. These were the cynodonts, and they are deeply important to our larger story, even though they are not dinosaurs, because they are the ancestors of the mammals, and so they are, in the deeper sense, our own ancestors as well. The cynodonts of the Triassic were small, for the most part clever and quick, and they were beginning to develop the features that would one day define the mammals. Their teeth were becoming specialized, different shapes for different tasks. Some of them may have had fur, some of them may have been warm-blooded, or nearly so, able to keep their bodies warm from the inside rather than relying on the heat of the sun. They cared for their young perhaps more attentively than the reptiles around them. But in the Triassic world, ruled by the great archosaurs, the cynodonts kept to the margins, small and watchful, waiting for a future that was still unimaginably far away. And the plants of this recovering world were changing too. The forests that grew back after the great dying were not the same as the forests that had come before. Across the southern half of the supercontinent, a particular kind of seed fern came to dominate, a plant with distinctive forked leaves, and for 15 million years this plant spread across vast regions, forming great forests that fed and sheltered countless animals. In the drier interior, tough conifers and other hardy plants held their ground. The world was green again, though it was a strange green, an alien green, made of plants that have almost all since vanished from the earth. The climate of the Triassic was, for the most part, hot and dry. The supercontinent was still vast, still continuous, and so its interior was still a place of deserts and scorching heat. The great seasonal monsoons still swept in from the surrounding ocean, bringing their rains to the coasts before retreating again. Life adapted to these extremes, as life always does. The animals learned to make the most of the wet seasons and to endure the long dry seasons, and the plants developed deep roots to find water and tough leaves to hold it. It was a harsh world, but it was a functioning one, and across the millions of years of the early and middle Triassic, the diversity of life slowly returned. New species arose to fill the empty roles left by the great dying. The web of life grew richer and more intricate once again. And it was into this world, this recovering world ruled by the great archosaurs and dotted with the small watchful cynodonts, that the very first dinosaurs would eventually appear. But they did not appear with any fanfare. They did not arrive as conquerors. When the first dinosaurs walked the earth, they were small and unremarkable, easy to overlook, just one more kind of creature among the many that scurried and stalked through the Triassic landscapes. No one watching, if anyone could have watched, would have guessed that these modest little animals were destined to become the most successful land creatures the world had ever seen. To find the first dinosaurs, we must travel to a particular corner of the ancient supercontinent, to the region that would one day become South America, and we must look closely at the rocks that were laid down there in the Middle and Late Triassic. For it is in those rocks, in places like the dry valleys of what is now Argentina and Brazil, that paleontologists have found the oldest dinosaur bones in all the world. And what those bones tell us is a story not of immediate triumph, but of patient beginnings, of small creatures finding their footing in a world that already belonged to others. But before we meet those first dinosaurs face to face, let us pause and rest in this in-between moment. Hold in your mind the image of the Middle Triassic world. The great archosaurs striding across the land, the armoured herbivores grazing in the underbrush, the small cynodonts darting through the shadows, the forests of forked leaf ferns spreading across the southern lands, the deserts baking in the interior, the monsoons sweeping in and retreating, a whole world recovered from catastrophe, humming along in its harsh and ancient way, with no idea at all that something new was stirring in its midst. Breathe slowly and let that world turn quietly in the dark, and when you're ready we will go to meet the first of the dinosaurs. There is something deeply moving about beginnings, about the small quiet moments before greatness, when the future is still unwritten and the great ones of the world are still humble and overlooked. And the beginning of the dinosaurs is one of the most moving of all, because for all that they would one day become, they started out as some of the least impressive creatures in their world. So let us go now to meet them, gently, in the dry valleys of the ancient South, roughly 230 million years ago. Imagine a landscape of broad river plains, threaded with winding waterways that swelled in the wet season and shrank in the dry. The air is warm. Ferns and conifers grow along the banks of the rivers, and beyond them the land stretches away toward the dry interior. Great archosaurs move through this landscape, the rulers of the age, fearsome predators and lumbering armoured herbivores. The small cynodonts dig their burrows and hunt for insects in the leaf litter, and among all of these, easy to miss, there move a few small creatures that walk in a most unusual way. They walk on two legs. This is the first thing you would notice about them if you knew to look. Most of the animals in this world walk on four legs, with with their bodies held low to the ground. But these small creatures hold themselves upright, balanced on their two hind legs, their bodies tilted forward, their long tails held out behind them for balance. Their front limbs are smaller, freed from the work of walking, and end in grasping hands with flexible fingers. They are quick and light and alert, and they dart through the landscape with a nimbleness that the heavier animals around them cannot match. These are the first dinosaurs. One of the earliest we know was a creature that paleontologists have named Eoraptor, a name that means dawn thief, a fitting name for a creature standing at the very dawn of the dinosaur age. Eoraptor was small, only about 3 feet long from the tip of its snout to the end of its tail, and it would have weighed no more than a small dog. It was not a fearsome animal. It probably ate whatever it could find. Small creatures, insects, perhaps some plants, the diet of an opportunist making its way in a world full of larger and more dangerous neighbours. Another of these early dinosaurs was named Herrerasaurus, after the farmer who discovered the first bones. Herrerasaurus was somewhat larger than Eoraptor, perhaps reaching the size of a person, or a little more, and it was a hunter, with sharp teeth and grasping claws. But even Herrerasaurus, for all that it was a predator, was not the master of its world. It lived in the shadow of the great archosaurs, the ruling reptiles who were far larger and far more numerous. If you had surveyed that ancient landscape and counted up all the animals, the dinosaurs would have made up only a small fraction of them, perhaps no more than 5 out of every 100 creatures. They were a minor presence, a footnote, a curiosity. The world did not belong to them, not yet. And yet, hidden within these modest creatures were the seeds of everything that was to come, for the dinosaurs possessed certain features that, while they seemed unremarkable in the Triassic world, would prove to be enormous advantages when the world changed. Consider the way they stood and walked. Most reptiles of that age held their legs out to the sides, sprawling, the way a lizard does, so that their bellies dragged near the ground, and every step was a kind of effortful waddle. But the dinosaurs held their legs directly beneath their bodies, straight down like pillars. This is called an upright stance, and it changed everything about how they moved. An animal with an upright stance can move more efficiently, covering more ground with less effort. It can run faster and run longer. It can breathe more freely as it moves, because its lungs are not being squeezed from side to side with every step. It can grow larger too, because legs held straight beneath the body can support far more weight than legs splayed out to the sides. All of these advantages were locked up inside the small bodies of the first dinosaurs, waiting, like a promise not yet fulfilled. The dinosaurs may also have had something else, something we cannot see in the bones quite as clearly, but which the evidence increasingly suggests. They may have been warm-blooded, or at least closer to warm-blooded than most of the reptiles around them. A warm-blooded animal can keep its body at a steady temperature from the inside, burning energy to stay warm, rather than depending entirely on the warmth of the sun. This means it can be active in the cool of the morning, or on a cloudy day, or through the night when the cold-blooded creatures around it grow sluggish and slow. It is a costly way to live, requiring a great deal of food, but it offers a kind of freedom that cold-blooded animals do not have, and the dinosaurs, it seems, were beginning to enjoy that freedom. They had efficient lungs as well, with a system of air sacs that allowed them to extract a great deal of oxygen from the air, far more efficiently than the simple lungs of other reptiles. This same system of air sacs survives today in their descendants, the birds, and it is one of the reasons that birds can fly to such great heights and over such great distances. In the dinosaurs of the Triassic, these efficient lungs meant stamina, the ability to keep moving and keep breathing when other animals would have to stop and rest. And many of the early dinosaurs were generalists, able to eat a wide variety of foods rather than depending on any single source. Some ate meat, some ate plants, and some ate whatever they could get. This flexibility, this willingness to make do with whatever the world offered, would prove to be one of their greatest strengths. For specialists, animals that depend on one particular food or one particular way of life are vulnerable when the world changes. But generalists can adapt. They can shift their diets and their habits as conditions demand. And the world, as we shall see, was about to change in a way that would reward adaptability above almost everything else. But all of this lay in the future. For now, in the late Triassic, the dinosaurs were simply biding their time, though of course they did not know it, for animals do not bide their time on purpose. They simply lived, each one, generation after generation, doing what living things do, finding food and avoiding danger and raising their young. They spread slowly from their early homes in the south. They diversified, a little, into different forms. Some grew larger, some became more specialized. The earliest of the long-necked plant-eaters appeared, ancestors of the giants that would one day be the largest animals ever to walk the earth, though in the Triassic they were still modest in size, only the faintest hint of the colossi they would become. It is worth dwelling for a moment on how easily the dinosaurs might never have risen at all. They were a small group in a world full of larger and more successful animals. The great archosaurs, the relatives of the crocodiles, were doing wonderfully. They ruled the land, they filled the major roles, they showed every sign of continuing to dominate for ages to come. If the world had simply continued as it was, stable and unchanging, the dinosaurs might have remained forever in the margins, small and overlooked, perhaps eventually fading away entirely as so many groups of animals have done. There was nothing inevitable about their rise. There was no destiny written in the stars that the dinosaurs would inherit the earth. What there was, instead, was chance. Chance, and the particular set of features the dinosaurs happened to possess, and a world that was about to be turned upside down by forces far beyond the control of any living thing. For the climate of the Triassic, which had been hot and dry and stable for so long, was about to undergo one of the strangest transformations in the entire history of the planet. The sky was about to change. The rains were about to come. And when they came, they would not stop for a very, very long time. But that is the next part of our story, and we will come to it gently, as we come to all things. For now, let your mind rest on the image of those first dinosaurs, small and quick and unremarkable, darting through the ferns of the ancient South 230 million years ago, with no idea at all of the extraordinary future that awaited their kind. They were nobody special, these dawn creatures. They were just one more group of animals trying to make their way in a difficult world, and that, perhaps, is the most wonderful thing about them. That from such humble and uncertain beginnings, such greatness would one day grow. Rest now, and hold them gently in your thoughts, these small ancestors of the giants. Breathe slowly, let the ancient ferns sway in the warm Triassic air, and when you are ready, we will follow the dinosaurs forward into the strange wet world that was about to be born. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There are events in the history of our planet so strange that when scientists first found evidence of them, they could scarcely believe what the rocks were telling them, and of all these strange events, few are stranger than the one we come to now. For around 234 million years ago, in the late Triassic, the sky over the ancient world seemed to break open, and it began to rain. And the rain did not stop. Not for a day, not for a year, not for a century. The rain, in one form or another, continued for something close to 2 million years. Let that number settle gently in your mind. 2 million years of rain. It is a span of time so vast that it defeats the imagination. All of recorded human history, every empire and every city and every story ever written down, spans only a few thousand years. This ancient age of rain lasted hundreds of times longer than the whole of human civilization. If you had stood beneath that ancient sky when the rains began, your descendants, tens of thousands of generations later, would still have been waiting for them to end. It is a thing almost impossible to comprehend, and yet it happened, and we know it happened, because the evidence is written plainly in the stone. Now I should be careful here, because the truth is gentler and stranger than the simple picture of rain falling without pause for 2 million years. It was not that a single storm raged unbroken across all that time, drenching every inch of the world every moment of every day. That is not how weather works, and it is not what happened. What happened instead was that the entire climate of the planet shifted into a wholly different state, a far wetter state, in which rain fell with a frequency and an abundance that the world had not known in a very long time. The dry seasons grew shorter and gentler, the wet seasons grew longer and more intense. Across vast regions that had been deserts for ages, water now flowed and pooled and lingered. The whole rhythm of the world became a rhythm of water, and this wet age lasted, with its pulses and its variations, for roughly 2 million years. Geologists have given this remarkable event a name. They call it the Carnian pluvial episode. The word Carnian refers to the particular slice of late Triassic time in which it occurred, and the word pluvial simply means rainy. It is a clinical name for an event that was anything but clinical, an event that drowned deserts and transformed forests and reshaped the living world from one end of the supercontinent to the other, and remarkably, for a very long time, almost no one knew it had happened at all. It was only in recent decades that scientists pieced together the full scale of it, gathering clues from rocks scattered across the whole of the globe until the astonishing truth became undeniable. The story of how they found it begins in the mountains of northern Italy, in a range called the Dolomites, part of the Great Alps. There, geologists studying the ancient rocks of the Triassic noticed something that puzzled them. For layer after layer, the stone told a consistent story. Red sandstones, the kind of rock that forms in hot, dry conditions, the geological signature of a desert world. Layer upon layer of these red rocks, each one whispering the same word, dry, dry, dry. And then, suddenly, the rocks changed. The red gave way to grey, and the grey rocks were water rocks, the kind of sediment laid down by rivers and lakes and floods, hundreds of meters of them, deposited over an enormous span of time. Something had happened. The dry world had become a wet world and stayed wet for ages, before at last returning to dryness once more. At first the geologists thought this might be a local curiosity, some quirk of that particular corner of the ancient world. Perhaps a river had shifted its course. Perhaps some regional change had brought temporary moisture to that one place. Such things happen all the time in geology, and they mean little for the wider world. But then the same pattern turned up elsewhere, in other parts of Italy, in Austria, in Germany, in Britain. And as scientists looked further afield, they found it again and again on continent after continent, in what is now Argentina, in China, in North America, in the lands that would become Australia and Africa. Everywhere they looked, in rocks from this same slice of late Triassic time, they found the same thing, dry red rocks giving way to wet grey rocks, and then, ages later, returning to dryness. This was no local curiosity, this was global. The whole world had grown wet at once. The cause of all this rain, scientists came to believe, was once again the great fires of the earth. For in the late Triassic on the far side of the world from the ancient Siberian eruptions, another vast volcanic region had come to life. It lay in the part of the world that would one day be scattered across western North America, and geologists call it the Wrangellia province. And like the Siberian traps before it, the Wrangellia volcanoes did not erupt in tidy cones. They poured out floods of lava across enormous areas, and with the lava came gas, vast quantities of carbon dioxide vented into the sky over hundreds of thousands of years. And once again, the carbon dioxide warmed the world, but this time the warming had a different consequence. For when you warm the oceans, you increase the rate at which water evaporates from their surface, and the more water that rises into the air, the more water must eventually fall back down as rain. The warming oceans of the late Triassic became great engines of evaporation, pumping moisture into the sky in quantities the world had not seen for ages. And as the supercontinent itself had begun, ever so slowly to crack and pull apart, new seaways were opening, bringing the ocean's moisture closer to lands that had long been dry. The monsoons, those great seasonal rain systems, intensified beyond anything the planet had recently known, until they became something far greater. Vast circulation patterns that could carry the moisture deep into the heart of the continent and drop it there as rain. And so the rains came. Imagine standing in what would one day become Central Europe, at the height of this wet age. The sky above you is dark, not with the blackness of night, but with a heavy, oppressive grey that presses down upon everything, a ceiling of cloud that rarely breaks. The air is thick with moisture, so humid that every breath feels almost like drinking. And then the rain begins. Not a gentle shower, not even an ordinary storm, but curtains of water falling from the sky so densely that you can scarcely see through them. The sound is a constant roar, like standing beside a great waterfall. The ground vanishes beneath sheets of flowing water within minutes, and it goes on, not for hours, but for days, sometimes for weeks. And when the rain at last pauses, you do not find the dry ground you started with. You find mud, thick and churned and endless, stretching in every direction. You find standing water in every hollow and depression, and you find rivers, so many rivers, flowing where no rivers had flowed before, carving new channels across a landscape that had been desert for ages beyond counting. This was the world that the Carnian rains created, a world transformed, a world remade in water. The deserts of the interior, which had been dead zones where almost nothing could live, now bloomed with life. The first rains would have been chaotic, hammering down upon dry, hard, compacted soil that had no plants to hold it in place. Great floods would have torn across the landscape, carving channels, moving vast quantities of sediment, reshaping the very face of the land. But then, something wonderful happened. Seeds that had lain dormant in the soil for ages, waiting for conditions their ancestors had known, began to wake. Spores carried on the wind from the wetter coasts found themselves in lands that could at last support them, and the green began to spread. Within a span of time that, in geological terms, was the blink of an eye, the dead interior of the supercontinent was transformed from desert into something like a forest. Not a forest such as we know today, but a strange and beautiful one. A forest of tree ferns and early conifers, their roots forever soaked, growing in pure mud. There were horsetails the size of telephone poles, forming dense thickets along every waterway. There were standing pools and shallow lakes everywhere, for any hollow in the land became a place where water gathered and lingered. The rivers ran dark and thick with sediment, swelling in the wet seasons to spread across floodplains miles wide. The whole world grew lush and green and dripping, a vast wet wilderness where there had been only sand and stone before. And the smell of this world, if you could have stood within it, would have been overwhelming, though not unpleasant. It would have been the deep, earthy, mineral smell of rain falling on warm ground, amplified 1,000 times and lasting for ages, mingled with the green scent of growing things and the rich, dark smell of mud and the faint sweetness of rotting leaves. For in such a wet world, plants grew and died and decayed in endless abundance. And there would have been sound everywhere, the roar of rain, the rushing of swollen rivers, the drip and patter of water falling from 1,000,000 leaves in the brief pauses between storms, and life, the chirping of insects multiplying in the warmth and the wet, the calls of amphibians gathering in every pool to breed, the splash of fish in waters that had never held fish before. This wet world, this drowned and blooming world, was not the same everywhere, nor was it the same at all times. Scientists have found evidence of several distinct pulses of intense rain across the 2 million years of the episode, each one triggered, it seems, by a renewed surge of volcanic activity flinging more carbon into the sky. Between these pulses were somewhat drier intervals, though still far wetter than the desert world that had come before. The rain came and went, surged and ebbed, across hundreds of thousands of years, a great slow rhythm of water playing out across the face of the planet. And for the living things of the world, this transformation was both a catastrophe and an opportunity. It was a catastrophe for all the creatures and plants that had been beautifully adapted to the old dry world, for now their world was gone, replaced by something they could not survive. But it was an opportunity, a tremendous opportunity for any creature that could thrive in water and mud and endless rain. And among the creatures poised to seize that opportunity, though no one could have known it at the time, were the small, quick, adaptable dinosaurs. But we will come to their triumph soon enough. For now let the great rains fall gently in your mind. Let the deserts bloom into wet green forests. Let the rivers spread across the land and the pools fill every hollow, and the warm rain patter endlessly upon the leaves. There is something deeply soothing, is there not, about the sound of rain, the soft and steady fall of it, the way it washes the world clean and makes everything new. Let that ancient rain lull you now, the rain that fell for 2 million years, the rain that would remake the living world and open the way for the age of the dinosaurs. Breathe slowly, and rest, and let it fall. When a world changes, it does not change kindly. The transformation of the late Triassic, the great shift from a dry world to a wet one, was a wonder to behold, but it was also a time of endings. For every creature that found new opportunity in the rain, there was another that found only ruin. And so, as the waters spread across the supercontinent, a great turning began, a slow and sweeping change in which the old rulers of the world began to fade and new heirs began to rise. This is the story of that turning, and though it is a story of loss as well as gain, we will tell it softly as we tell all things here, for it happened so very long ago, and it all turned out in the end exactly as it was meant to. Consider first the plants, for the plants are the foundation upon which all the rest of life is built. Across the southern half of the supercontinent, for 15 million years, a particular seed fern had reigned supreme. It had spread across vast regions, forming great forests, feeding countless animals with its seeds and its leaves. It had survived the Great Dying. It had thrived in the long recovery. It was, by any measure, a tremendous success. But it was a success suited to the old dry world, for it had evolved to endure seasonal drought, with deep roots to find water in the dry months, and tough leaves to hold that water against the heat. And then the rains came, and the very thing that had made this fern so successful became its undoing, for its roots, designed to reach deep for scarce water, could not function in soil that was forever soaked and waterlogged. They rotted. The fungal diseases that thrive in constant damp, which the old dry seasons had always kept in check, now flourished and spread. The patterns of seeding and sprouting that had depended on the turning of wet and dry seasons no longer worked when the seasons themselves had dissolved into endless wet. And so, across hundreds of thousands of years, these great forests that had stood for ages began to fail. The fossil record shows it clearly. Before the rains, the pollen and leaves of this fern are everywhere, dominating the ancient landscapes. After the rains, they dwindle and fade, until at last they are gone from most of the lands they had once ruled. But where one plant failed, another rose to take its place. The conifers, the ancestors of the pines and firs and redwoods, had been present all along, but they had been minor players, restricted to particular corners of the world, overshadowed by the great seed ferns. The wet world was made for them. Their needle-like leaves, with their small surface area, resisted the fungal rot that thrived in the humidity. Their resinous sap gave them chemical defences against decay. Their roots could endure the waterlogged soils far better than the deep roots of the seed ferns. And so, as the ferns died back, the conifers spread, rising up to dominate the forests of the new wet world. This same shift can be read in the rocks of many lands, in Argentina and Australia, and the ice-free forests of what is now Antarctica. Everywhere, the same story. The old ferns declining, the conifers ascending, an entire kingdom of plants reordered by the coming of the rain. And when the foundation of a world changes, everything built upon it must change as well. The plant-eating animals that had spent ages adapting to feed upon the old ferns now found their food vanishing around them. Some of them adapted, learning to digest the new conifers, which required different inner workings, different digestive strategies, even different communities of helpful microbes in their guts. But many of them could not adapt quickly enough, and they faded from the world, their bones falling silent in the fossil record. The change reached into the seas as well. The coral reefs of the Triassic, which had recovered so slowly after the Great Dying, now faced a new ordeal. For all the rain falling upon the land had to go somewhere, and where it went was into the rivers, and where the rivers went was into the sea. Vast quantities of mud and sediment and fresh water poured off the drowned continents and into the coastal oceans. The water turned murky and brown, and the sunlight that the reef-building creatures depended upon could no longer reach them through the cloudy water. And so the reefs, once again, began to die, thinning and breaking apart and at last disappearing from many of the places they had grown. And with the reefs went all the creatures who had sheltered among them, the fish and the invertebrates and the hunters who patrolled their edges. The web of life in the shallow seas was rewoven, strand by strand, into something new. On the land, the great rulers of the Triassic, the mighty archosaurs of the crocodile line, now faced their own reckoning. These were animals built for the old world, many of them. The great predators, the armoured herbivores, the lumbering giants, all of them had thrived in the dry seasonal landscapes of the early and middle Triassic. But the wet world tested them sorely. Their large bodies required great quantities of food, and as the old food sources vanished and the landscape transformed, that food grew harder to find. The places where they laid their eggs, which needed to be dry, now flooded season after season, so that whole generations of young failed to hatch. The territories they had ruled drowned beneath the spreading waters. They did not all vanish at once, for extinction is rarely so sudden. But many of them dwindled, their numbers falling, their diversity shrinking, their long dominance beginning slowly to crumble. Among the creatures that struggled were animals that had been wonderfully successful in the dry world. There were pig-sized plant-eaters with specialized beaks, who had been among the most common large animals of their time, found at sites across the whole of the globe. The rains came and they began to falter. Their fossils grow scarcer in the wet world rocks. Their range contracts. Their diversity falls. They did not go extinct immediately, but they never recovered their former glory. The world had moved on, and they could not move with it. This is the quiet tragedy of specialization, that the very traits which make a creature successful in one world can doom it when that world gives way to another. And the amphibians, you might think, would have rejoiced in all this water, for amphibians need water to live and breed. But it was not so simple. Many of the amphibians of the Triassic had adapted to the seasonal world, breeding in temporary pools, enduring the dry months by burrowing or sheltering. They needed the dry seasons, in fact, to control the diseases and the parasites that thrive in constant damp, and to provide the signals that told them when to breed. When the pools never dried, and the wet never ended, these rhythms broke down, and many amphibian groups declined. Some of the great predatory amphibians, who had ruled the freshwaters as apex hunters, were hit especially hard, their fossils growing rare and many of their lineages vanishing entirely. But amid all this loss, life was not merely dying. Life was also being reborn. For every empty space left by a vanished creature was an opportunity for some other creature to expand and flourish. The constant rains created environments that had never existed before, vast wetlands, year-round rivers, great lake systems that endured for thousands of years. And these new habitats called out for new specialists, and evolution answered the call. New kinds of small reptiles arose, adapted to life in and around the water. New plants evolved to thrive in soils that were forever soaked, creating the first true swamp ecosystems. The insects, freed by the warmth and the moisture and the abundance of plant life, exploded into a riot of new forms. This is the great lesson written in the rocks of the Carnian world, and it is a lesson that runs through the whole history of life. Change is not simply destruction. Change is transformation. Yes, the old world died. Yes, creatures that had reigned for ages faded into extinction. But the dying made room for the living. The endings enabled new beginnings. And in the great reshuffling of the late Triassic, as the old rulers fell and the new opportunities opened, one group of animals was poised almost perfectly to seize the moment. You already know who they were. The dinosaurs. Those small, quick, adaptable creatures who had been living in the margins of the world, overshadowed by the great archosaurs, making up only a tiny fraction of the animals around them. The wet world was about to become their world. For nearly everything about them, every trait that had seemed unremarkable in the old dry age, was about to prove a tremendous advantage in the new wet one. And as the old rulers struggled and faltered and faded, the dinosaurs were about to step out of the shadows and into the light. But that is the next chapter of our story, the chapter of their rise, and it is a chapter full of wonder. For now let us simply rest in this great turning of the world. Let us hold it gently, the falling of the old and the rising of the new, the seed ferns yielding to the conifers, the great archosaurs giving way, the wetlands spreading and the insects multiplying and the small dinosaurs waiting, all unknowing, at the very threshold of their greatness. There is a deep peace in this, if you let yourself feel it. The peace of knowing that even loss has its purpose, that even endings carry beginnings within them, that the world is always turning, always changing, always making itself new. Breathe slowly. Let the old world fade softly into the past, and let yourself drift toward the dawn of the dinosaurs. And now we come to the heart of our story, the moment we have been travelling toward through all these long ages, the moment when the dinosaurs ceased to be a footnote in the history of life, and became its leading chapter. It is a story of the most unlikely kind of triumph, the triumph of the overlooked, the rise of the humble to the heights of the world, and it is all the more wonderful because there was nothing certain about it. The dinosaurs did not conquer the earth through sheer might. They inherited it, you might say, through a combination of good fortune and good fitness, by being exactly the right kind of creature in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Let us return then to the wet world of the late Triassic, in the latter part of the Great Age of Rain, and in the period that followed it. The transformation of the world was well underway. The old forests had given way to conifers. The old rulers, the great archosaurs of the crocodile line, were struggling and beginning to decline. The wetlands had spread across the land, and the rivers ran year-round, and the whole face of the world had been remade in water. And into this transformed world the dinosaurs began, at last, to flourish. The fossil record tells the story in stone, layer by layer. In the rocks laid down before and during the early part of the Great Rains, the dinosaurs are scarce, a small presence among many larger groups. But in the rocks laid down during and after the height of the Wet Age, something remarkable appears. The dinosaurs begin to multiply, their numbers grow, their forms diversify. New species appear, and then more still. Where once there had been only a handful of kinds of dinosaur, there now arose dozens and then hundreds. Their bodies began to vary, some growing larger, some staying small and swift, some becoming specialized for eating plants, and others for eating meat. In a span of time that, by the slow measure of geology, was extraordinarily brief, the dinosaurs went from bit players to major figures upon the stage of life. Why did they rise? What was it about these creatures that allowed them to flourish where so many others faltered? The answer lies in those features we spoke of before, the features that had seemed so unremarkable in the old dry world but which proved to be tremendous gifts in the new wet one. Consider, first, their upright stance, their legs held straight beneath their bodies like pillars. In a world of mud and shallow water and unstable waterlogged ground, the way an animal moves becomes a matter of life and death. A sprawling creature, with its legs splayed out to the sides and its belly low to the ground, sinks deep into soft mud and must struggle with every step, burning precious energy just to move. But an upright dinosaur, with its legs beneath it and its body held high, could stride across the soft ground far more easily, covering more distance with less effort, going where the sprawling creatures could not follow. Consider, next, their warm-blooded nature, or at least their tendency toward it. The wet world was a world of clouds, a world where the sun was often hidden behind that heavy grey ceiling for days or weeks at a time. A cold-blooded creature depends upon the warmth of the sun to heat its body and give it energy, and in a world of perpetual cloud such a creature grows sluggish and slow. But a warm-blooded dinosaur, generating its own heat from within, could remain active regardless of the weather, hunting and foraging and moving through the grey wet days while its cold-blooded rivals lay torpid and still. In a clouded world this was an advantage almost beyond measure. Consider too their efficient lungs, with those wonderful air sacs that drew so much oxygen from each breath. This gave them stamina, the ability to keep moving and keep working when other animals would have to stop and rest. And consider their flexibility, their willingness to eat many kinds of food, for the generalists fare far better than the specialists when the world is in upheaval and the old reliable food sources are vanishing. And consider, finally, their modest size, at least in the beginning. The wet world was a patchwork place, a mosaic of small dry refuges scattered among the floods, of forested islands divided by rivers and lakes. The great archosaurs needed vast territories to support their large bodies, and such territories were hard to come by in the broken wet landscape. But the small dinosaurs could thrive in pockets, in the little dry places too small to support the giants, and from those pockets they could spread. Biologists have a name for what happened next. They call it an ecological release. When the dominant creatures of a world are knocked back, when the great competitors falter and fade, then suddenly the smaller, overshadowed creatures find themselves with room to grow, room to spread, room to evolve into all the forms that the vanished rulers had once denied them. And that is precisely what happened to the dinosaurs. As the great archosaurs declined, the dinosaurs surged into the spaces they left behind. They moved into the roles of the great predators. They moved into the roles of the great plant-eaters. They diversified with astonishing speed, filling niche after niche, until they had become the dominant creatures of the land. The fossil record from the time after the Great Rain shows this transformation with stunning clarity. Where the dinosaurs had once made up only a small fraction of the animals in any given place, they now made up a third, then nearly half, of all the species in many ecosystems. The old rulers were mostly gone or going. The great predatory archosaurs of the crocodile line had dwindled to a few survivors. The armoured herbivores were in decline. The mammal-like cynodonts, our own distant ancestors, had retreated into small bodies and nocturnal habits, becoming the little shrew-like creatures that would scurry through the undergrowth for the next 150 million years, waiting for a future that was still unimaginably distant. The dinosaurs had risen, and the world was theirs. Some of these early triumphant dinosaurs are preserved for us in the rocks with wonderful clarity. In the lands that would become the American Southwest, there lived a slender, swift predator, perhaps 10 feet long, that hunted in the late Triassic landscapes. Its bones were light and partly hollow, built for speed and efficiency, and the fossils suggest that these creatures may have lived and hunted in groups, a hint of the social complexity that dinosaurs would later display. It was among the first of the successful dinosaur predators to spread across a wide swath of the world. In the lands of the ancient South, there arose some of the first of the large plant-eating dinosaurs, creatures that could grow to 20 or 30 feet in length, exploiting the great abundance of plant life that flourished in the wet and recovering world. Their teeth show the marks of adaptation for processing tough vegetation, and their bodies show the first hints of the massive structures that would one day support the greatest giants the land has ever known. For this is the most extraordinary part of the dinosaurs' rise. It did not end with the late Triassic. Once they had taken hold, once they had become the dominant creatures of the land, they did not let go. The reorganization of the world by the great rains had not merely cleared away their competitors. It had created a world of abundance, a world of rich soils washed clean and renewed by the floods, a world of plentiful plant life and complex ecosystems. And in this rich new world, the dinosaurs continued to diversify and to grow, generation after generation, age after age. By the time the Triassic gave way to the next great period of Earth's history, the period called the Jurassic, the dinosaurs were not merely dominant, they were supreme. They occupied every major role in the living world of the land. They were the great long-necked giants, the largest animals ever to walk upon the earth, some of them stretching the length of several buses and weighing as much as a herd of elephants. There were the fearsome predators that hunted them. There were armoured dinosaurs and crested dinosaurs, and dinosaurs of forms so strange and varied that scientists are still working to understand them all. And the dinosaurs would hold this dominance for an almost incomprehensible span of time. From the end of the Triassic until the great asteroid that ended their reign, the dinosaurs ruled the Earth for something like 165 million years. To put that number in its proper place, consider that the whole of human existence, from the first creatures we might call human to the present day, spans only a few million years. The dinosaurs ruled for tens of times longer than humans have even existed. They spread to every continent. They adapted to every environment, from polar forests to tropical swamps to arid deserts. They developed complex behaviours, intricate social lives, elaborate displays. They were by any measure one of the most successful groups of large animals that has ever lived, and it all began with rain. With 2 million years of water falling from the sky, dissolving the old world and opening the way for a group of small overlooked reptiles to inherit the earth. There is something profoundly moving in this, I think, something worth carrying with you into your dreams. The dinosaurs did not rise because they were the strongest or the fiercest. They rose because they were adaptable, because they were flexible, because they were ready to make the most of a changing world when so many mightier creatures could not. The great rulers of the old world, the powerful and the dominant, could not bend with the changing times, and so they broke. But the humble dinosaurs, the overlooked dinosaurs, bent and adapted and flourished. There is a kind of quiet wisdom in that, a lesson written across 200 million years of stone, that it is not always the mighty who inherit the world, but sometimes the small and the supple and the willing to change. So rest now, and let the dinosaurs rise gently in your mind. See them stepping out of the shadows of the old world, spreading across the wet green lands, growing and diversifying and flourishing, until at last they stand triumphant beneath the clearing skies. See the great long-necked giants browsing among the conifer forests. See the swift hunters moving through the ferns. See a whole world coming alive with the forms of these wonderful creatures, a world that would be theirs for longer than the mind can easily hold. And know that all of it, every magnificent dinosaur that would ever live, traced its origins back to those small, humble beginnings and to the long age of rain that opened the door to their greatness. Breathe slowly, rest deeply, and let the age of the dinosaurs unfold softly around you. The dinosaurs were the great heirs of the transformed world, but they were not the only ones. For when a world is remade, the new opportunities do not fall to a single group alone. They are scattered widely, across every level of life, and many different creatures reach out to grasp them. The age of rain that gave us the dinosaurs gave us a great many other things besides, things that still surround us today, things whose origins lie hidden in those ancient wet millennia. And so, before we follow the rain to its eventual end, let us pause to honour these other heirs, the lesser-known winners of the wet world, whose stories are every bit as wonderful as the dinosaurs' own. Let us begin in the air, with the first creatures ever to truly conquer the sky. For it was in this same span of time, around the beginning of the Great Rains, that the first flying reptiles appeared in the fossil record. They are called pterosaurs, and they were not dinosaurs, though they were close cousins, members of that same great archosaur family. They were the first vertebrates, the first animals with backbones, ever to achieve true powered flight. Not merely gliding, the way some creatures can spread a flap of skin and sail from tree to tree, but real flight, flapping their wings, generating their own lift and thrust, climbing and diving and banking through the open air. The earliest pterosaurs were small, perhaps no larger than a seabird, with long tails that helped them balance in flight and slender teeth perfectly suited for catching insects or small fish. Their wings were not made of feathers, for feathers as we know them belong to a future still far away. Instead, their wings were made of skin, a thin, tough membrane stretched between an enormously elongated finger and the side of the body and down to the hind limbs, like a living kite. It was a strange and marvellous design, utterly different from the wings of birds or bats, and yet it worked, and it carried these creatures aloft into a realm that no animal with a backbone had ever entered before. And the wet world was a wonderful place for them to learn to fly. The great new conifer forests, with their dense canopies soaking up the sun, created rising columns of warm air, thermals and updrafts that a flying creature could ride. The constant rains and the patterns of wind gave them currents to navigate, and the explosion of insect life, of which we will speak more in a moment, gave them an endless supply of food. The early pterosaurs spread and diversified, some specializing in catching insects on the wing, others becoming fishers, skimming across the surfaces of the great new lakes and rivers to snatch their prey from the water. They spread across the supercontinent with remarkable speed, their fossils appearing on widely separated lands, evidence of creatures that could travel great distances through the air. They were the pioneers of the sky, and their descendants would one day include the largest flying animals that have ever existed, creatures with wingspans wider than a small airplane. But it all began here, in the wet world, with small winged reptiles taking to the cloudy skies for the very first time. Now let's come down from the air and look to the water, to meet another group of heirs whose name will surprise you, for they are the crocodiles, or rather, the ancestors of the crocodiles. When you picture a crocodile, you no doubt imagine a creature lurking in a river, half submerged, waiting to ambush whatever comes to drink at the water's edge. And that is indeed how the crocodiles of today live. But their ancestors in the late Triassic were nothing like this. The earliest crocodile relatives were creatures of the land, swift and slender, running on long upright legs through the forests and across the plains. Some were no bigger than a house cat. Others were the size of a wolf. Some may have climbed trees, some dug burrows, a few specialized in eating insects. They looked, in truth, far more like small dinosaurs than like the crocodiles we know. But the wet world, with its endless water, offered these land-dwelling crocodile cousins an opportunity they could not ignore. For the rains had created rivers that flowed year-round, and lakes that never dried, and wetlands that stretched for hundreds of miles, and in all that water there swam an abundance of fish. And so, over the long ages, different lineages of these creatures began, independently, to take to the water. Some developed flattened tails to help them swim. Some developed nostrils that migrated toward the tops of their snouts so that they could breathe while mostly submerged. Some developed the bony armor that would become the signature of their kind. This was not a single event but a pattern repeated again and again, as group after group discovered that the waterways of the wet world were rich with food and ripe with opportunity. By the end of the Great Rains, there were many kinds of semi-aquatic and fully aquatic crocodile relatives, ranging from small fish-eaters to substantial predators. The crocodile way of life, perfected in the waters of the late Triassic, would prove so successful that it has endured in one form or another for the more than 200 million years since, all the way down to the crocodiles and alligators that bask along the rivers of the world today. And let us not forget the seas, for the oceans too were transformed by the great rains and gave rise to their own new airs. The vast quantities of fresh water and sediment pouring off the drowned continents had thrown the marine world into turmoil, lowering the saltiness of the coastal waters, creating great brackish zones where rivers met the sea, disrupting the old patterns of ocean life. The marine reptiles that had ruled the Triassic seas faced a crisis as their prey shifted and their habitats changed. But crisis, as we've seen again and again in this story, creates opportunity, and so new lineages of marine reptiles arose, or old lineages diversified into new forms. There were long-bodied swimmers with powerful tails that radiated into many species, some developing teeth for crushing shellfish, others becoming swift pursuit predators chasing fish through the changed seas. There were the ichthyosaurs, the fish lizards, sleek dolphin-shaped reptiles that had returned to the sea and now diversified into new shapes and sizes, some becoming deep divers, others haunting the shallow coastal waters. And the great reshaping of the marine world in this age set the stage for the magnificent sea reptile dynasties that would rule the oceans through the long ages of the dinosaurs, the great long-necked plesiosaurs, and the fearsome plesiosaurs whose ancestors first stirred in the troubled waters of the late Triassic. But of all the heirs of the wet world, perhaps none flourished more spectacularly than the smallest of them, the insects. For the insects had been present on the Earth for a very long time already, more than 200 million years before this age of rain. But the wet world sent their evolution into overdrive. The great new conifer forests created endless new habitats, dead wood to tunnel through, and seeds to eat and leaves to chew. The standing water everywhere provided breeding grounds for the young of aquatic insects. The humidity favoured the soft-bodied creatures that would have dried out in the old harsh deserts, and so the insects exploded into a riot of new forms. The beetles, which would one day become the most numerous and diverse group of animals on the entire planet, with hundreds of thousands of kinds, underwent a great flourishing in this age. The first true flies appeared, and with them came a revolution in the recycling of life, for the larvae of flies break down dead plants and animals and return their nutrients to the soil, without which the great forests would have drowned in their own debris. The ancestors of the dragonflies and the mayflies and the caddisflies all trace their origins to this wet age, developing those wonderful double lives in which they spend their youth underwater and their adulthood in the air. And all of these multiplying insects became food, an enormous abundance of food, for the fish and the early crocodiles and the flying pterosaurs and the small scurrying creatures of the forest floor. The wet world ran, in a very real sense, on insect power, and the foundations of the insect-rich world we know today were laid down in those ancient rains. And there is one more group of heirs we must honour, the most unexpected of all, for they are our own ancestors. The cynodonts, the mammal-like creatures descended from the old synapsids, had been living in the margins of the world, small and watchful, overshadowed by the great archosaurs. The wet world was not, at first glance, their moment of glory, for the dinosaurs claimed the great roles and the cynodonts remained small. And yet the wet world shaped them in ways that would prove decisive across the long ages to come. The explosion of insect life gave the small insect-eating cynodonts an abundance of food. The pressures of competing with the rising dinosaurs pushed them toward the very adaptations that would one day define the mammals. Some developed more efficient ways of breathing, allowing higher activity. Some developed more sophisticated teeth, of varied shapes for varied tasks. Some developed fur, or the beginnings of fur, to keep their small bodies warm in the cool damp nights. And some, the evidence suggests, began to care for their young in new and tender ways, guarding their nests and feeding their little ones, investing more deeply in fewer offspring. The foundations of the mammal way of life, the way of life that would one day be our own, were being quietly laid in the shadow of the dinosaurs, in the rain-soaked forests of the late Triassic. How wonderful it is to think of all these creatures rising together, all these different forms of life reaching out to grasp the opportunities of the transformed world. The dinosaurs taking the great roles upon the land, the pterosaurs claiming the open sky, the crocodile cousins slipping into the rivers and lakes, the marine reptiles reshaping the troubled seas, the insects multiplying into 1,000,000 forms, and the small cynodonts, our own ancestors, gathering in the margins the gifts that would one day make them mammals. All of them children of the same great change, all of them heirs of the same age of rain. The wet world was not merely the birthplace of the dinosaurs, it was a great forge of life, in which form after form was shaped and tempered and sent forth into the future. And much of the living world we know today, the birds in the trees and the crocodiles in the rivers, and the insects in the air and the mammals in the fields, and we ourselves walking upright beneath the sky, can trace some thread of our origins back to that ancient and transformative time. So rest now, and let all these creatures gather softly in your mind. The flying reptiles wheeling through the cloudy sky, the slender crocodiles slipping into the dark waters, the sleek sea reptiles gliding through the troubled seas, the countless insects humming in the warm wet air, and the small furred ancestors of the mammals, watchful in the undergrowth, carrying within them the seeds of a future none could yet imagine. A whole world coming alive, a whole world being made new, all of it born from the long slow falling of the rain. Breathe slowly, and let that living world cradle you, and rest. Nothing lasts forever, not even rain that seems eternal. And so, after something close to 2 million years, after age upon age of falling water, the great rains of the late Triassic began at last to fade. There was no single moment when it ended, no final storm that gave way to a final clearing sky. The change came as all great changes in the deep earth come, slowly and gradually across thousands upon thousands of years, so gently that no single generation of creatures would ever have noticed it happening. But it was happening. The age of rain was drawing to its close and a new world was preparing to be born. Far beneath the surface of the earth, on the side of the world that would one day become Western North America, the great volcanic system that had pumped its carbon into the sky for 2 million years was finally exhausting itself. The vast chambers of molten rock that had fed the eruptions were cooling and hardening. The fires were going out. And as the volcanoes fell silent, the flood of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere slowed, and then dwindled, and then ceased. Without that constant injection of gas to feed it, the great greenhouse warming that had supercharged the rains began, slowly, to ease. The world was not returning to what it had been before exactly, but it was finding a new balance, a calmer and a drier one. Imagine how it might have looked if you could have watched it unfold across the long centuries. In the tropical heart of the supercontinent, the afternoon storms that had fallen with such reliability for ages began, here and there, to fail. Some days the rains came as they always had, but some days, increasingly, they did not, and the sun broke through the parting clouds and touched the soaked ground with a warmth it had not felt in a very long time. The great rivers, which had carved their channels across the drowned land, began slowly to shrink, their flows lessening year by year. The floodplains that had been underwater for ages began to emerge, and the mud that had been saturated for millennia began to dry and crack and harden, and the plants that had evolved to live in permanent swamps suddenly found themselves exposed to air and to the occasional dryness, and many of them perished, but some survived. The ones that had held on to a little drought tolerance, the ones that could endure a dry spell, these endured, and in enduring, they inherited the new world. The great seasonal monsoons that had dominated the interior began to weaken and to moderate. The temperature differences between the ocean and the land, which had driven the mighty rain systems, began to soften. The summers were still wet, but no longer catastrophically so. The winters grew drier, sometimes dry enough that the soil could crack and the plants could feel the press of real thirst. And this was something new, or rather something old returning, for the world was beginning once more to know the turning of wet and dry, the rhythm of seasons that the long endless rain had washed away. For the first time in 2 million years, the creatures of the world had to learn again to live with dryness, to endure the dry months and rejoice in the wet ones. And this forced yet another round of adaptation, a final sorting, in which the survivors of the rain now had to prove they could survive its departure as well. In the higher latitudes, far from the tropical heart of the world, the changes were even more dramatic. Lands that had been temperate rainforests for 2 million years began to transform, first into seasonal forests, then into open woodlands, and in some places into something approaching the open grasslands of a much later age, though true grasses would not evolve for 100 million years yet. The great wetlands, those vast accumulations of peat and decay that had built up throughout the rainy age, began to dry. Some became drier forests, some became seasonal wetlands, flooded for part of the year and dry for the rest. The whole face of the world was shifting, settling, finding its new and calmer shape. And the geological record preserves all of this for us, written in the patient language of stone. If you could read the rock cores drawn up from the lands of this ancient age, you would see the change laid out layer by layer, the dark, organic, rich rocks that mark the waterlogged conditions of the great rains give way, as you move upward through the layers, to lighter-coloured sandstones and mudstones, rocks that show the marks of seasonal drying, of cracking, of exposure to the air. You would see the very texture of the sediments change, growing coarser, telling of stronger seasonal rivers. You would see the appearance of red beds, rocks stained by iron that has rusted in the open air, a thing impossible during the endless wet. You would even see the return of evaporate deposits, the minerals that form when water dries up and leaves its dissolved salts behind, a clear sign that the waters were now retreating and the dry seasons returning. The whole story of the rain's ending is there in the rocks, for those who know how to read it. But the most profound changes of all were happening in the oceans. The vast flood of fresh water and sediment that had poured into the seas for 2 million years finally began to slow. The coastal waters that had been so murky and so choked began, slowly, to clear. The saltiness of the seas began to return to its normal balance. The chemistry of the oceans, thrown into chaos by the volcanic carbon and the endless river runoff, began at last to stabilize, and as the seas grew clearer and calmer, the life within them began to recover and to spread. The coral reefs, which had been reduced to scattered remnants clinging to the clearest and most stable waters, began once more to grow. They were not the same reefs that had grown before, for the old reef builders had mostly perished. They were new kinds of coral, kinds that had arisen during the long crisis, and learned to endure more variable conditions, and they would go on to build the foundations of reef ecosystems that endure in their descendants to this very day. The shelled creatures of the sea, who had been so battered by the long upheaval, began to diversify once more, radiating into hundreds of new forms, each adapted to a different depth, a different way of feeding, a different corner of the recovering seas. On the land, the world that emerged from the rain was scarcely recognizable as the world that had entered it. When the rains had begun, the land was ruled by the great archosaurs of the crocodile line, and by the lingering plant-eating synapsids. When the rains ended, those old rulers were mostly gone. The synapsids had dwindled to small nocturnal creatures hiding in burrows, the ancestors of the mammals biding their time. The great crocodile line archosaurs had been reduced to a fraction of their former glory, and the world now belonged to the dinosaurs. But they were not yet the dinosaurs of legend, not yet the towering giants that fill our imaginations. The earliest dinosaurs of this new world were still relatively modest creatures, swift and bipedal, mostly hunters, none of them larger than a large dog or a small pony. But they carried within them every gift they would need to build their long dynasty. They were fast, they were efficient, they were warm-blooded or nearly so, and above all they were adaptable, possessed of a body plan that proved capable of being shaped into a staggering variety of forms. For over the long ages that followed, this dinosaur body plan would be moulded by evolution into nearly every conceivable shape, from small creatures the size of birds to giants the size of whales, from swift two-legged hunters to armoured four-legged tanks, from long-necked browsers reaching into the treetops to crested plant-eaters honking through the swamps. The diversification began here, in the world that emerged from the rain, in the changing landscapes and recovering ecosystems of the late Triassic, and it would continue for the better part of 200 million years. The pterosaurs, those pioneers of the sky, found the new world much to their liking. As the climate dried and the forests opened up, there was more room in the open air, more space for aerial hunters to wheel and soar. The crocodiles, too, continued to thrive. For though the world was drying, the rains had left behind a great legacy of rivers and lakes and wetlands, and these persisted, providing perfect homes for the semi-aquatic predators that the crocodile line had become, and the small mammal ancestors continued their patient work in the margins, refining the gifts they had gathered in the wet world, waiting for a future that was still beyond all imagining. The ecosystems themselves were fundamentally different now from what they had been before the rain. The most obvious change was in the plants. The seed ferns and the moisture-loving plants that had dominated the wet world gave way once more to conifers and other seed plants, hardy trees with deep roots and tough, drought-resistant needles, capable of enduring the seasonal swings of the new climate. They could grow in soils that dried out for part of the year. They could survive the wildfires that grew more common as the dry seasons allowed dead wood to accumulate and burn, and over the long ages these conifer forests spread across much of the supercontinent, creating the green landscapes that the dinosaurs would call home through all the long ages of their dominance. The flowering plants, the flowers and the fruiting trees that fill our world today had not yet evolved and would not appear for another 100 million years. But the seed plants that ruled the world after the rain were laying the groundwork for them, developing the strategies of pollination and seed dispersal and partnership with animals that the flowering plants would one day refine. The world was also becoming, after the rain, more varied and more diverse in its geography. During the height of the great rains, much of the world had grown strangely uniform, for everything was wet and everything was warm, and everything looked more or less the same. But as the climate stabilized and the rains receded, the regions of the world began once more to differ from one another. The deep interior of the supercontinent became truly arid again, developing the first great deserts since before the rain. The coastal regions remained wetter, clothed in forests and woodlands. The high latitudes, though still far warmer than the poles of today, grew more seasonal, with distinct times of growth and times of rest. And this growing variety of environments drove a growing variety of life, for creatures adapting to deserts developed different traits than creatures adapting to forests, and populations isolated from one another by distance and by differing conditions began to diverge, to become distinct, to multiply into new forms. The homogenizing sameness of the great rains gave way to a diversifying richness, and this is part of why the late Triassic and the early Jurassic that followed it saw such an explosion of new kinds of life across every group: the dinosaurs and the pterosaurs and the crocodiles and the mammals and the marine reptiles and the fish and the insects. The world was opening up again, creating new opportunities faster than life could fill them, and life rushed in to fill them all the same. Scientists today use this great transition, this shift from the wet world to the world that followed, as a marker to divide the long Triassic period into its distinct phases. There is the world before the rain, ruled by the synapsids and the early archosaurs. There is the time of the rain itself, a period of crisis and turnover, when old lineages faded and new ones emerged. And there is the world after the rain, the late Triassic and the early Jurassic, the world in which the age of dinosaurs began in earnest. This division is not arbitrary. It is written in real and measurable changes, in the rocks and in the fossils, in the very species that ruled the planet. The age of rain was a true hinge of history, a moment when one world ended and another began, and the world that came after was so changed from the world that came before that the two can hardly be recognized as the same planet. And here is a thought to carry softly into your rest, a thought both humbling and strangely comforting. This whole great transformation, this 2 million years of rain that remade the living world and opened the way for the dinosaurs, was caused by volcanoes pumping carbon into the sky, by a warming climate, by a hydrological cycle thrown into overdrive. It is not so very different in its broad shape from the changes our own world is passing through now, though ours are unfolding far more swiftly. And the deep past tells us what such changes can bring. They bring upheaval. They bring the falling of the old and the rising of the new. They bring winners and losers, the fading of creatures perfectly suited to a world that no longer exists, and the rising of creatures that had waited, overlooked in the margins. But the deep past tells us something else as well, something gentler. It tells us that life endures, that after even the greatest upheavals, life does not merely survive but flourishes, diversifies, fills the transformed world with new and wonderful forms. The world that emerged from the great rains was richer and more various and more full of life than the world that had entered them. The earth did not break, it transformed, and out of that transformation came the dinosaurs and the birds, and in the long fullness of time came us. So rest now and let the rains fade gently away in your mind. Hear the great storms grow softer and less frequent. See the sun break through the parting clouds and touch the drying land. Watch the rivers shrink and the floods recede and the world settle into its new and calmer shape. See the conifer forests spreading across the renewed land, and the dinosaurs flourishing among them, and the whole living world coming alive again in new and wondrous forms. There is such peace in the ending of a long reign, such a deep and quiet relief in the clearing of the sky. Let that peace settle over you now. Breathe slowly, and let the new world dawn softly around you. We have followed the dinosaurs from their humble beginnings, small and overlooked, through the great age of rain that opened the door to their rise, and into the transformed world where they became the masters of the land. But the story of their origin would not be complete without a glimpse of what they became, and of the long shadow they cast across all the ages that followed, a shadow that reaches, in surprising ways, all the way to the world outside your window tonight. So let us linger a while longer in the deep past and trace the dinosaurs forward through their golden age, and discover the legacy they left behind. When the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic around 200 million years ago, the dinosaurs crossed another threshold. For there was another extinction at the end of the Triassic, another upheaval that swept away many of the creatures that had competed with the dinosaurs, including most of the remaining great archosaurs of the crocodile line. And once again, the dinosaurs came through, and once again they flourished in the aftermath, expanding to fill the spaces left empty by the fallen. By the height of the Jurassic, the dinosaurs were not merely dominant, they were supreme, and they had grown to sizes that strain the imagination. Consider the great long-necked giants, the sauropods, the largest creatures ever to walk upon the dry land of the earth. Some of them stretched the length of several school buses placed end to end. Some weighed as much as a dozen elephants or more. They held their long necks high, sweeping them across the treetops to browse on the highest leaves, or low and wide to graze across great swathes of the forest floor without moving their massive bodies. Their legs were like the trunks of trees, vast pillars of bone and muscle holding up their colossal weight. Their tails stretched out behind them, long and tapering, perhaps cracking like whips to ward off predators. To stand beside such a creature, if any human ever could have, would have been to feel impossibly small, dwarfed by a living thing larger than any building most people would ever see. And these giants traced their ancestry, all of it, back to those small bipedal plant-eaters of the late Triassic, who had themselves arisen in the world remade by the great rains. Consider too the great predators that hunted in these ancient forests, the theropods, the meat-eating dinosaurs who walked on two legs and seized their prey in clawed hands and toothed jaws. Some of them hunted alone, and some, the evidence suggests, may have hunted together in groups, coordinating their attacks with a cleverness that hints at rich inner lives. They came in every size, from small, swift creatures little larger than a chicken, to enormous beasts that stood taller than a person and could have swallowed a person whole, and these too traced their ancestry back to the small dinosaurs of the late Triassic, refined and enlarged across the long ages into the fearsome hunters of the dinosaur golden age. And there was such variety beyond these. There were armoured dinosaurs, plated and spiked, lumbering through the underbrush like living fortresses, protected from the great predators by their bony defences. There were horned dinosaurs, with great frills and sharp horns adorning their heads. There were the duck-billed dinosaurs, who moved in great herds and may have communicated with one another through the hollow crests upon their heads, trumpeting calls echoing across the ancient plains. There were dinosaurs with strange sails upon their backs, and dinosaurs with armoured clubs upon their tails, and dinosaurs of forms so peculiar that scientists are still working to understand how they lived and why they took the shapes they did. The dinosaurs spread to every continent, for in their early days the lands were still joined, and even as the continents slowly drifted apart across the long ages, the dinosaurs went with them, adapting to every land and every climate. There were dinosaurs in the tropics, and dinosaurs in the polar forests, dinosaurs in the deserts, and dinosaurs in the swamps. They filled the world as no group of large land animals had ever filled it before or has ever filled it since. And they ruled, in this way, for an almost unimaginable span of time. From the end of the Triassic until the very end of their reign, the dinosaurs were the dominant land animals of the Earth for something like 165 million years. It is worth pausing once more on that number, for it is so vast that the mind slides off it. Our own kind, the species of human beings to which you and I belong, has existed for only a few 100,000 years. The creatures we might broadly call human, our close ancestors and relatives, have existed for only a few million years. The dinosaurs ruled for far longer than the entire span of human existence, longer by far than the time since the first creature we might call human first stood upright upon the African plains. Empire after empire of dinosaurs rose and fell within their long reign. Whole families of them flourished and faded and were replaced by others. Continents drifted across the face of the world. Mountain ranges rose and eroded away. Seas opened and closed. And through it all, age after age, the dinosaurs endured, the lords of the land, the great and lasting heirs of that ancient age of rain. We tend to think of the dinosaurs as creatures of the distant and alien past, utterly removed from our own world, and in many ways they were. But they were not so simple and not so cold as we sometimes imagine. The evidence that scientists have gathered, patiently, from the rocks, reveals creatures of surprising sophistication. Many dinosaurs cared for their young, building nests and guarding their eggs and tending their hatchlings, much as birds do today. Some lived in great herds, finding safety and society in numbers. Some were swift and warm-blooded, burning with an inner fire that kept them active and alert. And many of them, we now know, were covered not in scales, but in feathers. Yes, feathers, those soft and intricate structures that we associate with birds. Feathers did not evolve for flight, at least not at first. They evolved, it seems, among the dinosaurs, perhaps for warmth, perhaps for display, long before any creature used them to take to the air. Many of the small predatory dinosaurs were clothed in downy feathers or in more elaborate plumage, creatures more like enormous strange birds than like the scaly monsters of old imagination. The world of the dinosaurs was warmer and softer and more familiar than we once believed. And this brings us to the most wonderful part of the dinosaurs' legacy, the part that connects their ancient world to our own. For the dinosaurs are not entirely gone. It is true that the great reign of the dinosaurs came to an end around 66 million years ago, when an asteroid struck the Earth and unleashed a catastrophe that swept away the great dinosaurs along with much of the life of that age. The towering sauropods, the fearsome predators, the horned and armoured and crested giants, all of them perished in that final cataclysm, and the long age of dinosaur dominance came to its close. But not every dinosaur died. For among the feathered dinosaurs, there was one lineage that had taken those feathers and learned to fly, that had grown small and light and swift and lifted itself into the open air. We call these creatures birds, and the birds survived. So when you hear a bird singing in the morning, when you see a sparrow hopping along a branch or a hawk circling high against the clouds, or a flock of geese crossing the autumn sky, you are looking at a dinosaur, not a relative of the dinosaurs, not a distant cousin, but a true dinosaur, a living descendant of those ancient creatures, carrying their blood and their breath and their feathers forward into the present day. The dinosaurs never truly left us. They are all around us still, singing in the trees, nesting under the eaves, crossing the sky on feathered wings. The age of dinosaurs has never really ended. It has only changed its form, and every one of those birds, every robin and every eagle and every tiny wren traces its ancestry back through the long ages, back through the golden age of the great dinosaurs, back to those small bipedal creatures of the late Triassic, and back, beyond them, to the world remade by the 2 million years of rain. And the dinosaurs left another legacy as well, a quieter one, but one that touches us most personally of all. For their long reign shaped the world that the mammals would one day inherit. Throughout all those 165 million years of dinosaur dominance, the mammals, the descendants of those small synodonts who had gathered their gifts in the wet world, lived in the margins. They stayed small. They stayed cautious. Most of them were active by night, when the great dinosaurs slept, scurrying through the undergrowth, eating insects and seeds, raising their young in burrows and hidden places. For more than 100 million years, the mammals waited, patient and overlooked, just as the dinosaurs themselves had once waited before their rise, and when the great asteroid struck and the age of the giant dinosaurs ended, it was the mammals' turn at last. Into the world swept clean of the great dinosaurs, the mammals rushed, and they diversified, and they grew, and they spread, and they rose to a dominance of their own. And from among those rising mammals, in the long fullness of time, came the primates. And from among the primates came our own ancestors. And from among them, at the very end of this immense chain of cause and consequence, came us. It is a remarkable thing to contemplate, as you lie here in the quiet dark. Every step of this vast story was necessary for you to exist. Had the great dying not swept the world clean, the synapsids might never have given way, and the archosaurs might never have risen. Had the great rains not fallen for those 2 million years, the dinosaurs might never have triumphed, and the world might have taken some entirely different path. Had the dinosaurs not risen to dominance, and held it for so long, the mammals might never have been pressed into the small nocturnal forms that shaped them into what they became. And had the dinosaurs not eventually fallen, the mammals might never have had their chance to rise. You're here, breathing softly in the dark because 234 million years ago, the sky broke open and the rain fell for 2 million years. The thread of cause and effect runs unbroken from that ancient deluge to this very moment, to the rise and fall of the dinosaurs, to the rise of the mammals, to the rise of you. We're all of us children of the deep past, shaped by events so ancient and so vast that we can barely comprehend them, carried forward on a river of time that began long before us and will flow on long after we're gone. There is no fear in this, only wonder and a kind of deep belonging. For it means that you are connected, by an unbroken chain of life and change, to every creature that ever lived. To the small dinosaurs darting through the Triassic ferns, to the great sauropods browsing among the Jurassic conifers, to the feathered hunters and the horned giants, and the swift small mammals waiting in the dark, to the birds that sing outside your window even now. You are part of the same great story, the same vast unfolding, the same endless turning of the world. And the story is not finished, for it never finishes. It only continues, age after age, change after change, life always enduring, life always finding its way forward into whatever new world the future brings. So rest now, and let this great chain of ages settle softly around you. Feel yourself as one link in an unbroken chain that stretches back through the rise of the mammals, through the long reign of the dinosaurs, through the age of rain, through the great dying, back to the very dawn of complex life upon the earth. Feel how deeply you belong to this old and patient world, how the same forces that shaped the dinosaurs shaped you, how the same rain that fell 200 million years ago set in motion the long chain of events that brought you, at last, to this quiet moment of rest. Breathe slowly, let the wonder of it fill you gently, and let the whole vast story of life cradle you towards sleep. Before we let this story carry us fully into sleep, let us return for a while to wander more slowly through the ancient world, lingering over the details that we passed by too quickly in our first journey. For the deep past rewards patience, and there is so much more to see if we move gently and take our time. Let us go back once more, all the way back to the world before the dinosaurs, and walk through it as travellers, noticing the small things, breathing the ancient air. Imagine yourself standing on a low rise of land in the late Permian world, looking out across a coastal plain that stretches toward a distant sea. The light is strange to your eyes, for the sun hangs in a sky that holds more carbon than the sky you know, and the air is warm and heavy. Below you, near the slow brown river that winds across the plain, you can see the great plant-eating synapsids gathered at the water's edge, their barrel bodies dark against the pale mud. They move slowly, these creatures, in no hurry, their thick legs sinking slightly into the soft ground with each step. They lower their heavy heads to crop the tough vegetation that grows along the bank, and the sound of their grazing carries faintly up to where you stand, a low, steady tearing and chewing, the patient music of large herbivores at their endless work. Among them, you might notice the smaller forms of the young keeping close to their mothers, mimicking the grazing of their elders, and at the edge of the herd, half hidden in the shade of a stand of primitive trees, you might catch a glimpse of something watching, a predator, long and low, its eyes fixed on the herd, its body utterly still. This is one of the great hunters of the Permian world, patient as stone, waiting for its moment. It will not rush. It cannot afford to. In this harsh world, energy is precious, and a failed hunt is a costly thing. So it waits and watches, and chooses its moment with the care of a creature that has hunted this way for its whole life, and whose ancestors hunted this way for ages before it. The plants around you are unlike any you have ever seen. There is no grass beneath your feet, only bare earth and low-spreading growths and the litter of fallen fronds. The trees, if you can call them trees, are strange things, some of them more like giant ferns than like the oaks and pines of your own world, with great spreading crowns of forked leaves. Others are early conifers, their forms a little more familiar, their needled branches rustling faintly in the warm wind. There are tall horsetails near the water, segmented and hollow, and low cycad-like plants with their stiff radiating leaves. The colours are greens and browns and the dusty reds of the dry soil, for there are no flowers anywhere to add their bright hues to the scene. The world has not yet invented the flower. It will not do so for 100 million years and more. The air carries scents both familiar and strange. There is the green smell of the plants, and the muddy smell of the river, and the warm dusty smell of the dry land beyond. There is the faint animal musk of the great herd at the water's edge. And underneath it all, perhaps, there is a faint sharpness in the air, a hint of the volcanic gases that even now are beginning, far away to the north, to seep into the sky, though no creature here can know what those gases foretell. The sounds are the rustle of leaves, the grazing of the herd, the distant call of some unseen creature, the lapping of the slow river against its banks. It is a peaceful scene, in its way, a moment of calm in a harsh world. And yet it is a doomed world, this Permian world, though it does not know it, for the great dying is coming, and almost nothing you see before you will survive it. Let us move forward then, past the catastrophe, into the recovering world of the early Triassic, and walk through it as well. The scene is bleaker now, in the immediate aftermath of the great dying. The land is sparse, the vegetation thin and struggling. But there is life. There, rooting through the low scrub, you can see the stout form of Lystrosaurus, that humble survivor who inherited the broken world. It is an unlovely creature, with its barrel body and its strange beaked face and its two small downward tusks. But there is something endearing in its persistence, something hopeful in the way it goes about its business of survival in a world that has been so badly wounded. And it is not alone. There are others of its kind scattered across the plain, for in this age, Lystrosaurus is everywhere, the most abundant large animal in all the world, the inheritor of the empty earth. As the ages pass and the world recovers, the scene grows richer. The vegetation thickens, new creatures appear, and now, in the Middle Triassic, you might stand in a landscape ruled by the great archosaurs, the ruling reptiles. There, striding across the plain on legs held tall beneath its body, comes one of the great predatory archosaurs, a fearsome hunter with a long-toothed jaw and a powerful build. It moves with surprising grace for so large a creature, its head held high, its eyes scanning the landscape for prey. The smaller creatures of the plain scatter before it, darting into burrows and underbrush. And among those scattering creatures, if you look closely you might see them, the small swift forms of the first dinosaurs, no larger than dogs, fleeing from the great predator along with all the rest. Just one more kind of small prey animal in a world ruled by giants. You would never guess, watching them flee, that their descendants would one day dwarf the very predator that hunts them now. But that is the way of deep time. The mighty fall and the humble rise, and the world is forever turning. Now let's move forward once more into the age of rain, and stand within the wet world at the height of its strangeness. The change is total. Where there was dry plain, there is now swamp and forest and flowing water. The air is thick with humidity, warm and close, heavy in your lungs. Above you, the sky's a low grey ceiling of cloud, and the light that filters through it is soft and green and dim. All around you rise the tree ferns and the early conifers, their trunks dark with moisture, their roots sunk deep in the black mud. Water drips from every leaf. The ground squelches beneath your feet. Pools of standing water lie everywhere, reflecting the grey sky, dotted with the spreading leaves of water plants. And the sound is everywhere. The patter of dripping water, the gurgle of running streams, the chorus of unseen amphibians calling from every pool, the hum and whir of countless insects in the wet air. And here, In this wet world, the dinosaurs are no longer fleeing. Here they are thriving. There, picking its way through the swamp on its 2 long legs, comes a dinosaur, alert and confident, moving with an ease that the heavier creatures of the old world cannot match. It pauses to snap at a darting insect, then moves on, sure-footed across the treacherous wet ground. Nearby, a small group of plant-eating dinosaurs browses among the low vegetation, their long necks reaching for the tender shoots. They are not yet the giants they will become, but they are growing, generation by generation, into the great forms of the future. The wet world is their world, and they move through it as creatures who belong, who have found their moment, who are rising at last into the inheritance that the long rain has prepared for them. How strange and beautiful it is to walk in imagination through these vanished worlds, to see the slow turning of the ages laid out before us like the chapters of a long and patient story. The peaceful doomed Permian, with its grazing herds and its watching predators, the broken recovering early Triassic with its humble inheritor scattered across the empty land, the Archosaur-ruled Middle Triassic, with the small dinosaurs fleeing among the underbrush, and the wet world of the great rains with the dinosaurs rising at last into their greatness. Each of these worlds was real. Each of them turned beneath the same sun that shines on you. Each of them was home to living creatures who breathed and ate and slept and raised their young, just as you breathe and eat and sleep tonight. And each of them gave way, in time, to the world that followed, in the long unbroken chain that leads at last to your own quiet moment of rest. Let these vanished worlds drift through your mind now, one after another, like scenes glimpsed from the window of a slow train passing through the deep past. There is no need to hold on to any of them. Simply let them pass, gently, one giving way to the next, the Permian to the Triassic, the dry world to the wet, the old rulers to the new. Feel the slow, patient rhythm of it, the great unhurried turning of the ages. Breathe slowly. Let your thoughts grow soft and dim, like the green light filtering through the canopy of an ancient forest, and let the deep past carry you, gently and without fear, toward the quiet country of sleep. There is a question that may have been drifting at the edge of your thoughts as we have travelled together through these ancient ages, a gentle and natural question, and it is this. How can we possibly know any of this? How can anyone speak with confidence about a world that vanished 200 million years before the first human drew breath, about rains that fell and creatures that lived and worlds that turned long before there was anyone to witness them? It is a beautiful question, and the answer is one of the quietly heroic stories of human curiosity, a story of patient men and women piecing together the deep past from the faintest of clues, reading the history of the world in stone. Let us spend a little while with this story, for it is a soothing thing to contemplate, this slow, careful work of understanding, and it will deepen your wonder at all we have seen. Everything we know about the deep past, we know because the earth keeps records. It keeps them in stone, in the layers of rock that build up year by year and age by age, as sediment settles and hardens and is buried beneath the sediment that comes after. Each layer is like a page in an enormous book, and the layers are stacked in order, the oldest at the bottom and the youngest at the top, so that to read down through the rock is to read backward through time. This is the first and most fundamental principle of the science that studies the deep past, the simple and profound idea that lower means older. A geologist standing before a cliff face, looking at the bands of rock laid down one upon another, is looking at a calendar of the ages, a record of time made solid and lasting. And within those layers of rock the earth preserves the traces of the life that existed when each layer was laid down. These traces are what we call fossils, and they come in many forms. Most often, when we think of fossils, we think of bones, the hard parts of ancient creatures buried in sediment and gradually turned to stone as minerals seep in and replace the original material, atom by atom, until what remains is a perfect stone copy of the bone that once was. But fossils are far more than bones. There are fossil teeth, harder than bone and often better preserved, which can tell us what an ancient creature ate. There are fossil footprints, pressed into ancient mud and then buried and hardened, which can tell us how a creature moved and how fast it travelled, and even whether it travelled alone or in groups. There are fossil eggs and fossil nests, which tell us how ancient creatures raised their young. There are even fossils of skin and feathers, preserved in rare and wonderful circumstances, which tell us what creatures looked like in life. and there are fossils of plants, of leaves and seeds and pollen, and fossils of the tiny creatures of the sea, and fossils of the burrows that animals dug and the droppings they left behind. The Earth, it turns out, is an extraordinarily careful keeper of records, if only we know how to read them. The reading of these records is the work of many kinds of scientists working together. There are the paleontologists, who study the fossils of ancient life, who dig the bones from the rock and clean them and study them and piece them together to understand the creatures they came from. It is patient and painstaking work. A single skeleton may take years to excavate and prepare, each bone carefully freed from the surrounding stone, each fragment numbered and recorded and fitted into place. And from these bones, the paleontologist can reconstruct not just the shape of an ancient creature, but a great deal about how it lived. The shape of a tooth reveals a diet. The structure of a leg reveals a way of moving. The size of an eye socket reveals whether a creature was active by day or by night. The space within a skull reveals the size and shape of a brain. From the silent bones, the patient scientist coaxes forth the living creature, restoring it, in imagination and understanding, to the world it once inhabited. And there are the geologists, who study the rocks themselves, who read the story of ancient environments in the texture and the chemistry and the structure of the stone. It was geologists, you will remember, who first noticed the strange change in the rocks of the Italian mountains, the shift from dry red sandstone to wet grey sediment, that first hinted at the great age of rain. A geologist can look at a layer of rock and tell you a great deal about the world that made it. Coarse sediment with large grains speaks of fast-flowing water, of rivers in flood. Fine sediment settling slowly speaks of still water, of quiet lakes and calm seas. Ripple marks preserved in stone speak of water, flowing across a sandy bottom. Mud cracks speak of ground that dried out beneath the sun. Beds of salt and other minerals speak of water that evaporated away, leaving its dissolved substances behind. Red rocks, stained by rusted iron, speak of conditions where oxygen reached the sediment, and dark rocks, rich in the carbon of decayed plants, speak of waterlogged swamps where the dead did not fully rot away. The whole history of ancient climates and ancient environments is written in these patient clues for those who learn the language of the stone. But how do we know the ages, the actual numbers, the millions upon millions of years? How can anyone say that the great rains fell 234 million years ago, rather than 200 million or 300? This is perhaps the most wonderful part of the whole science, for it rests on the steady ticking of natural clocks hidden within the rocks themselves. Certain minerals, when they form, contain small amounts of particular substances that decay very slowly and very steadily into other substances over enormous spans of time. The rate of this decay is constant and known with great precision, and so, by measuring how much of the original substance remains in a mineral and how much has decayed into its products, scientists can calculate with remarkable accuracy how long ago that mineral formed. It is a kind of clock, set ticking at the moment the rock was made, and read, ages later, by the careful hands of science. By these clocks, the deep past has been measured and dated, the great events of Earth's history pinned to their places in time, the long story of life given its true and staggering dimensions. And there is more still. There is the study of the ancient chemistry preserved in the rocks, which can reveal the temperatures of long-vanished seas and the composition of long-vanished skies. There is the study of the slow drift of the continents, which can reconstruct the shapes of the ancient lands and show us how the single supercontinent of the Triassic broke apart, across the ages, into the scattered continents of today. There is the careful comparison of fossils from around the world, which reveals how creatures spread and how they were related, and how the great families of life branched and grew. And in our own time there is the study of the deep code of life itself, the molecules within living creatures, which can confirm the relationships first guessed at from the bones, which can show us, for instance, that the birds truly are the living descendants of the dinosaurs, carrying the ancient lineage forward in their very cells. It is humbling to think of how much patient labour lies behind every sentence of the story we have told tonight. Behind the simple statement that the rains fell for 2 million years lie decades of careful work by countless scientists, the digging and the measuring and the comparing and the calculating, the the slow accumulation of evidence from rocks scattered across every continent, the gradual piecing together of clues into a coherent and confident picture. No single person discovered the Age of Rain. No single person worked out the rise of the dinosaurs. These understandings were built up slowly, collaboratively across generations, each scientist adding a piece to the great puzzle, each new discovery refining and deepening the picture drawn by those who came before. It is one of the finest things our species has ever done, this patient reconstruction of the deep past, this reading of the history of the world in stone, and it means that the ancient worlds we have walked through tonight are not mere fancies or imaginings. They are real worlds, recovered by patient science, as real as the world outside your window, only older, far older, lost in the great gulf of time but brought back, piece by patient piece, into the light of human understanding. There is something deeply restful in this, I think, for it means that the deep past is not lost, not truly. It is preserved in the patient stone and recovered by the patient mind. The creatures that lived and died 200 million years ago are not entirely gone, for their traces remain, and through those traces we can know them, can imagine them, can walk in our minds through the worlds they inhabited. Nothing is ever wholly lost. The earth remembers, the stone keeps its records, and the patient curiosity of those who came before us has unlocked those records and laid the deep past open before us like a great and wonderful book. So as you rest tonight, you may take comfort in this, that the world is knowable, that even its most ancient secrets can be patiently uncovered, that the long story of life is not a darkness but a light, growing ever brighter as we learn to read it. Breathe slowly, let the patient work of understanding settle softly over you, and rest in the knowledge that the deep past is safe, remembered in stone, recovered in wonder, held gently in the long memory of the world. The great Age of Rain was not the same everywhere, nor was it the same at all times, and there is a deep pleasure in wandering through its many faces, in seeing how the endless water touched different corners of the ancient world in different ways. For the supercontinent was vast, stretching from pole to pole, and the rain that transformed it fell upon mountains and plains, upon coasts and deep interiors, upon lands near the warm equator and lands far toward the cold poles. Let us drift, then, across the breadth of the wet world, and see the many shapes that the great rains took, and let the gentle variety of it carry us deeper toward rest. Begin in the deep interior of the supercontinent, in the heart of the land that had once been the great desert. Here the transformation was most dramatic of all, for here the change was greatest, the leap from bone-dry wasteland to dripping wetland the most extreme. In the years before the rain, this had been a place of red rock and shifting sand, of scorching days and bitter nights, a place where almost nothing could live. And then the rains came, and the dead heart of the continent began to fill with water. The first floods would have been violent, tearing across the hard dry ground that had no plants to hold it, carving deep channels, moving great masses of sand and stone. But as the water kept coming and the plants began to spread, the violence gave way to something gentler. The channels filled with steady flowing rivers, the hollows filled with lakes, the ground softened and greened, and the dead interior became, across the long ages of the rain, a vast inland wilderness of swamp and forest and flowing water, a place transformed beyond all recognition, where once there had been only death. Move now toward the coasts, where the change was less extreme but no less profound. The coastal regions had always been wetter than the interior, watered by the moisture that swept in from the surrounding sea. But the great rains intensified even this, turning the seasonal monsoons of old into something far mightier. The coastal forests grew lush and dense, their canopies dripping, their floors thick with ferns and mosses and the litter of fallen leaves. The rivers that ran down to the sea swelled into great brown torrents, carrying their loads of mud and sediment out into the coastal waters. And where the rivers met the sea, vast new environments formed, great brackish zones where fresh water and salt water mingled, where new kinds of life found new kinds of homes. The coasts of the wet world were places of tremendous fertility and tremendous change, where the transformed land met the troubled sea in a great churning abundance of life. Travel toward the equator, to the warm heart of the wet world, and you would find the rains at their most intense. Here the warmth of the tropical sun drove the great engines of evaporation and convection, pulling moisture up from the warm seas and dumping it back down as rain. The equatorial regions of the wet world were places of almost perpetual storm, where the grey clouds gathered thick and the rain fell in great drenching curtains, where the air was so warm and so wet that it felt almost like a living thing pressing against the skin. The forest here grew with a wild exuberance, fed by the heat and the endless water, a riot of green growth reaching toward the dim and clouded sky. And travel toward the poles, far from the equator, and you would find a stranger sight, for even the high latitudes of the wet world were warm by the standards of our own age. There were no great ice caps in this ancient world, no frozen poles locked in glaciers. The lands near the poles were cool, perhaps, and dim through the long polar nights, but they were not frozen, and they too felt the touch of the great rains. There were forests in these high latitudes, forests that endured the long darkness of the polar winter and the long light of the polar summer, watered by the rains that fell even here at the ends of the earth. The fossils tell us so. The traces of moisture-loving plants preserved in rocks that formed near the ancient poles. The great rains reached everywhere, from the burning equator to the dim and gentle poles, touching every corner of the vast supercontinent with their transforming water. And the rain changed across time as well as across space, for the great age of rain was not a single steady downpour, but a series of pulses, surges of intense wet separated by intervals of relative calm. Scientists who have studied the rocks of this age have found the evidence of at least 4 major pulses of intense rain across the 2 million years of the episode, each one, it seems, triggered by a renewed surge of volcanic activity, flinging fresh carbon into the sky. Imagine the rhythm of it, played out across hundreds of thousands of years, a great pulse of rain, the wettest of times, the world drowning in water, then a gradual easing, the rains growing less intense, the world drying somewhat, though never returning to true dryness. Then another pulse, another surge of volcanic carbon, another drowning of the world, and so on, again and again, across the long ages, a great slow heartbeat of rain, surging and ebbing, while the living world adapted and readapted to each turn of the cycle. These pulses mattered greatly for the creatures of the wet world, for each one was a fresh test, a fresh sorting of the living from the dying. The creatures that could endure the wettest times survived to flourish in the calmer intervals. The creatures that could not endure faded away. And with each pulse, the great turning of the world advanced a little further, the old dry world creatures losing a little more ground, the new wet world creatures gaining a little more. The dinosaurs, adaptable and flexible, came through each pulse and flourished in each interval, rising a little higher with each turn of the great wet cycle. And so the pulses of the rain were like the slow strokes of a great hand, shaping the living world pulse by pulse toward the age of dinosaurs. There is one more wonder of the wet world worth dwelling on, and it is a small and beautiful one. Among the great new conifer forest that spread across the wet world, the trees produced resin, that sticky golden sap that oozes from the bark of wounded trees. And in the wet world, with its endless growth and its abundant trees, this resin flowed in great quantities. Sometimes, as it flowed, it would trap small creatures, an insect alighting on the bark, a fragment of leaf, a tiny spider. And sometimes that resin, with its trapped treasures, would harden and be buried and preserved across the ages, slowly transforming into amber, that beautiful golden stone. And so, locked within drops of ancient amber from this very age, scientists have found tiny perfect fragments of the wet world. Insects and plant fragments preserved in exquisite detail, 230-million-year-old time capsules, holding within them small pieces of a vanished world. Imagine it, a tiny insect, going about its small life in the wet forests of the late Triassic, alighting on a tree, trapped in a drop of resin, and held there, perfectly, for 230 million years, until at last it is found and wondered at by creatures it could never have imagined. There is something almost unbearably tender in this perfect preservation of the smallest and most fleeting of lives, held safe across an ocean of time. So let us rest now amid the many faces of the rain, the drowned interior transformed from desert to swamp, the fertile coasts where land met sea in churning abundance, the storming equator, drenched beneath its perpetual clouds, the dim and gentle poles, watered even at the ends of the earth, the great slow heartbeat of the pulses surging and ebbing across the long ages, and the tiny perfect treasures locked in golden amber, small lives held safe across the gulf of time. Let all of it drift gently through your mind, the vast and varied wet world in all its strange beauty, all of it falling softly under the same endless rain. There is such peace in rain, such a deep and ancient comfort in the sound of falling water. Let it fall now in your imagination, soft and steady and endless, across the whole of the ancient world. Breathe slowly, and let the rain carry you down, gently, into sleep. We have spoken of the first dinosaurs as a group, these small, swift creatures who rose from the margins of the world. But each of them was its own kind of creature, with its own way of living, its own place in the ancient world, and there is a quiet joy in meeting them one by one, in lingering over each of these dawn creatures and imagining its small life in the deep past. So let us walk now among the earliest dinosaurs and meet a few of them as individuals, as the living creatures they once were, going about their days in the lands of the ancient south. Let us begin with the one whose name means dawn thief, that small creature of the early dinosaur age. Picture it, no longer than the length of your arm and your hand together, standing balanced on its two slender hind legs, its long tail held out behind it for balance, its small clawed hands held before it. Its head is small and narrow, set with sharp little teeth, but the teeth at the front of its mouth are different from the teeth at the back, a curious mixture suggesting that this creature ate both meat and plants, taking whatever the world offered. It is a quick and nervous creature, alert to every movement, for it lives in a world full of larger and more dangerous animals, and its survival depends on its wits and its speed. Watch it move through the underbrush, darting from cover to cover, pausing to snatch an insect or to nibble at a tender shoot, always watchful, always ready to flee. It is not a fearsome creature, this little dawn thief. It is a survivor, a maker-do, an opportunist finding its small way in a crowded world. And yet within its small body it carries the body plan that will one day be shaped into the greatest land animals the world has ever known. Now let us meet a larger creature, the one named for the farmer who found its bones. This one is a true hunter, reaching perhaps the length of a tall person or somewhat more, built for the chase and the kill. Its hind legs are long and powerful, its body lean and balanced, its hands armed with curved claws for seizing prey. Its jaws are set with sharp curved teeth, edged like little knives, perfect for slicing flesh. This is one of the early predatory dinosaurs, a creature that made its living by hunting the smaller animals of its world. But even this hunter, for all its weapons, is no king of its age. It lives alongside the great archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, who are larger still and more numerous, and it must compete with them and avoid the greatest of them. Watch it stalking through the ferns, its head low, its eyes fixed on some small prey animal ahead. It moves with a careful, deliberate grace, placing each foot with care, freezing when its prey looks up, gliding forward when its prey looks away. It is a skilled hunter, this early predator, and its kind will give rise, across the long ages, to all the great meat-eating dinosaurs of the future, to the fearsome hunters that will one day rule the land. Let us meet too one of the early plant-eaters, an ancestor of the great long-necked giants that are still to come. This one walks sometimes on 2 legs and sometimes on 4, for it is a creature in transition, its body not yet committed to the 4-legged stance that its giant descendants will adopt. It is larger than the little dawn thief, perhaps the size of a large pig or a small cow, with a longer neck than its meat-eating cousins, and a small head set with leaf-shaped teeth, perfect for stripping vegetation. It moves slowly and peacefully through the forest, reaching up to browse on the leaves of the conifers and the tree ferns, or lowering its head to crop the low growth near the ground. It has no weapons to speak of, no claws or teeth for fighting, only its size and its watchfulness to protect it from the hunters that share its world. But it is doing well, this gentle browser, for the wet world is rich in plants, and there is food enough for a creature that lives by eating green things. And in its lengthening neck, in its growing size, in its leaf-shaped teeth, we can see the first faint hints of the colossal sauropods that its descendants will become, the greatest creatures ever to walk the dry land of the earth. These early dinosaurs lived together in a shared world, and it is worth imagining that world as they would have known it. Not from above as we have often pictured it, but from within, from the level of a small creature making its way through the landscape. To the early dinosaur, the world was a place of green shadows and dappled light, of the constant possibility of danger and the constant search for food. The great archosaurs were terrors to be avoided, vast shapes moving through the forest to be watched for and fled from. The other small creatures of the world, the early mammals and the lizards and the amphibians, were neighbours and sometimes prey and sometimes competitors. The plants were food and shelter, and the green walls of the only world the creature had ever known. The rivers were sources of water and danger both, places to drink and places where hunters waited. And the rain, the endless rain of the Great Wet Age, was simply the way the world was, a constant presence. The soft grey ceiling of the sky, and the steady patter of water on the leaves and the squelch of mud beneath the feet. A day in the life of an early dinosaur would have followed the rhythm of light and dark, of hunger and rest, of safety and danger. In the dim grey dawn, the creature would wake from wherever it had sheltered through the night, and it would set out in search of food, moving through the wet forest with care, alert for both prey and predators. Through the long day it would forage, eating what it could find, resting when it could, always watchful. It might encounter others of its own kind, and there might be some brief interaction, a display, a squabble, a moment of recognition. It might flee from a hunter, its heart racing, its legs carrying it swift and sure across the treacherous ground. It might find a good meal, a swarm of insects or a patch of tender plants, and eat its fill. And as the dim light faded toward the dark of the wet world night, it would seek shelter once more, some hollow or thicket or burrow, where it could rest in relative safety until the dawn. A small life, a quiet life, repeated day after day, generation after generation, across the long ages, while the great slow processes of evolution shaped these small creatures imperceptibly toward their mighty future. We will never know the individual early dinosaurs, of course. We will never know the particular creatures who lived and died in the ancient South, the specific dawn thieves and hunters and browsers who went about their small lives so long ago. Their individual stories are lost forever, swallowed by the immensity of time. We know them only as kinds, as species, as types of creature reconstructed from scattered bones. And yet it is worth remembering that each of them was, in its day, an individual, a single living creature, as real and as present in its own world as you are in yours. Each of them woke to the dim wet dawns and foraged through the green days and sheltered through the dark nights. Each of them knew hunger and fear and the small satisfactions of a meal found and a danger escaped. Each of them was, for its brief span, alive, fully and completely alive, in a world that was the only world it knew. And from these countless small lives, these uncountable individual creatures living and dying across the long ages, came the great river of descent that led, at last, to all the dinosaurs that would ever live, and beyond them to the birds, and beyond them, in the great fullness of time, to us. So rest now, and hold these small dawn creatures gently in your thoughts. The little dawn thief, darting through the underbrush, the lean hunter stalking through the ferns, the gentle browser reaching up to crop the leaves. See them moving through their green and shadowed world, small and alive and unaware of the greatness that lay in their future. Feel the quiet dignity of their small lives, the patient persistence of these creatures who carried, all unknowing, the seeds of a mighty dynasty. And let their gentle presence soothe you, these ancestors of the giants, these humble beginnings of the age of dinosaurs. Breathe slowly. Let the green shadows of the ancient forest gather softly around you, and let the small dawn creatures keep their quiet watch as you drift towards sleep. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a question that runs quietly beneath the whole of this story, a question that the deep past poses again and again, and it is worth sitting with for a while in the gentle dark. Why do some creatures survive when others perish? Why, when a world is overturned, do certain animals fade into extinction while others rise to inherit the transformed earth? It is a question without simple answers, but the long story of life offers us some quiet wisdom on the matter, and there is comfort in that wisdom, a comfort worth carrying into sleep. The first thing the deep past teaches us is that survival is rarely about strength. We tend to imagine, perhaps, that the creatures who endure are the mightiest, the fiercest, the most powerful. But the story of the dinosaurs tells us otherwise. When the great rains came, it was not the mightiest creatures who flourished. The great archosaurs, the powerful rulers of the old dry world, the largest and most dominant of the land animals, these were the ones who struggled and faded. And the small dinosaurs, the overlooked and the unremarkable, these were the ones who rose. Again and again in the history of life, this pattern repeats. The mighty fall, and the humble inherit the earth. For might is suited to a particular world, and when that world changes, might becomes a burden rather than a blessing. The great require great resources, great territories, great quantities of food, and when the world is overturned and those things grow scarce, the great are the first to suffer. It is the small and the flexible and the adaptable who slip through the narrow gates of catastrophe, who make do with little, who bend with the changing world rather than breaking against it. The second thing the deep past teaches us is that survival is often about chance. There is a temptation to think that the survivors deserved to survive, that they earned their endurance through some merit of their own. And there is some truth in this, for the traits that aid survival are real traits, real advantages. But there is also a great deal of luck in the matter, more than we might like to admit. A creature perfectly adapted to its world may perish simply because it happened to live in the wrong place when the catastrophe struck, while a less impressive creature endures simply because it happened to live in some sheltered corner that the catastrophe spared. The early dinosaurs possessed real advantages, the upright stance and the efficient lungs and the flexible diet. But they also possessed the great advantage of happening to exist, in a modest and adaptable form, at exactly the moment when the world was about to reward modesty and adaptability. Had they evolved a little differently, or lived in a different place, or arisen at a different time, the whole story might have gone otherwise. There is no destiny in the rise of the dinosaurs, no fate written in advance. There is only the meeting of particular creatures with particular circumstances, the endless dance of chance and fitness that drives the great unfolding of life. The third thing the deep past teaches us is perhaps the gentlest of all, and it is this. Extinction, terrible as it is not the end of life, but the turning of it. When the great archosaurs faded, the world did not grow emptier. It grew fuller, for the spaces they left were filled by the rising dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs flourished into a greater variety of forms than the archosaurs had ever achieved. When the great dinosaurs themselves eventually perished, the world did not grow emptier. It grew fuller, for the spaces they left were filled by the rising mammals, and the mammals flourished into a greater variety of forms than the world had seen before. Extinction clears the way. It opens the spaces in which new life can grow. It is, in its strange and difficult way, a kind of mercy, a making room, a turning of the great wheel of life so that new forms may have their chance to flourish. Without the great dying, the dinosaurs might never have arisen. Without the fall of the dinosaurs, the mammals might never have risen, and we ourselves might never have come to be. Every ending in this long story is also a beginning. Every loss makes room for some new flourishing. The wheel turns and life goes on, ever renewing, ever changing, ever finding new forms in which to express its endless creativity. It is worth pausing here to consider the difference between the two great catastrophes that bracket the dinosaurs' rise and fall. For the dinosaurs rose in the aftermath of slow catastrophes, the long volcanic upheavals of the great dying, and the gradual transformation of the great rains, changes that unfolded across hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And the dinosaurs fell, at the end, to a sudden catastrophe, the asteroid that struck the Earth in a single terrible moment and unleashed its devastation across mere years and decades. There is something instructive in this contrast. The slow catastrophes, for all their devastation, gave life time to adapt, time to shift and change and find new ways of being. The dinosaurs rose precisely because the changes that made them, though vast, were slow enough that adaptable creatures could ride them to new heights. But the sudden catastrophe at the end gave no such time. It struck too fast for adaptation, too fast for the great dinosaurs to find new ways of being, and so it swept them away. The pace of change matters as much as its scale. Life can endure tremendous transformation, If only it is given time enough to adapt, it is sudden change faster than life can answer, that does the deepest harm. This is a thought worth holding gently, for it speaks to our own age as well, though we need not dwell on that tonight, for this is a time for rest and not for worry. It is enough to know that the deep past holds these lessons, that the long story of life has wisdom to offer, that even in the great catastrophes of the ancient world there is meaning to be found and comfort to be taken. Life endures. It always endures. It bends and adapts and finds new ways of being. The mighty fall and the humble rise. Endings make room for beginnings. The great wheel turns and life goes on. These are the quiet truths written across 200 million years of stone, and there is deep peace in them if we let ourselves feel it. And there is a final comfort here, the deepest of all. For you, lying here in the quiet dark, are yourself a survivor, in the deepest sense. You are the descendant of an unbroken line of survivors stretching back across all the ages we have walked through tonight. Every one of your ancestors, every single one across all the hundreds of millions of years, survived long enough to pass on the thread of life. Through the great dying, through the age of rain, through the long reign of the dinosaurs, through the asteroid and its aftermath, through the rise of the mammals and the dawn of the primates, and the long slow emergence of humankind. The thread of life that leads to you was never once broken. You are here because life endured, again and again through catastrophe after catastrophe, across an immensity of time that staggers the imagination. You are the living proof that life finds a way. You carry within you the inheritance of every survivor who came before, the deep resilience of life itself, refined and tested across the longest of ages. There is no greater testament to the endurance of life than the simple fact of your own existence, breathing softly in the dark at the end of an unbroken chain that reaches back to the very dawn of complex life upon the earth. So rest now and take comfort in these quiet truths. Survival is not about strength, but about adaptability, about flexibility, about the willingness to bend with a changing world. Chance plays its part, and so does fitness, in the endless dance that shapes the living world. Extinction is not an ending, but a turning, a making room, a mercy in its difficult way. And you yourself are a survivor, the heir of all the survivors who came before, the living proof that life endures. Let these truths settle softly over you like a warm and gentle blanket. Feel your deep connection to the long story of life, your place in the unbroken chain of endurance. Breathe slowly. Let go of all worry and all striving, and rest, secure in the knowledge that life finds a way, that it always has, that it always will, and that you are part of that great and patient enduring. While the dinosaurs rose and the great rains fell, another vast and patient process was unfolding beneath the feet of all the living creatures of the ancient world, a process so slow that no creature could ever have perceived it, and yet so profound that it would reshape the entire face of the planet. The single great supercontinent, the All-Land, was beginning to break apart, and the slow breaking of the world would shape the destiny of the dinosaurs in ways both subtle and profound, scattering their descendants across continents that did not yet exist, dividing their kingdoms by seas that had not yet been born. Let us spend a while with this great slow drama, for there is a deep and soothing patience in it, the patience of the moving earth itself. To understand the breaking of the supercontinent, we must understand that the surface of the earth, solid and unchanging as it seems to us, is in truth always moving. The crust of the planet, the thin rocky skin upon which all life dwells, is broken into great plates, vast slabs of rock that float upon the hotter, softer material beneath. And these plates are always in motion, drifting across the face of the world at a pace so slow that it defies perception, no faster than the growth of a fingernail and yet relentless, unceasing, carrying the continents with them across the ages. Across the immensity of geological time, this slow drift moves mountains and opens oceans and tears continents apart and drives them together again, in a great slow dance that has been going on since the earth was young and will go on until it is old. In the time of the early dinosaurs, all the land of the world was gathered into the single supercontinent, the All-Land, which had itself been assembled by this slow drift across the preceding ages. as the scattered continents of an earlier world were driven together into one. But even as the dinosaurs were rising, the forces that had assembled the supercontinent were beginning to reverse. Deep beneath the crust, in the hot churning rock of the planet's interior, great currents were stirring, and these currents began to pull the supercontinent apart. The first cracks appeared, great rifts in the crust where the land was being stretched and torn. And along these rifts, the land began, ever so slowly, to separate. It was no coincidence, perhaps, that the great volcanic upheavals of this age, the eruptions that had triggered both the Great Dying and the Age of Rain, were bound up with this slow breaking of the world. For the same deep forces that stir the great plates also drive the volcanoes, and as the supercontinent began to crack and rift, the molten rock of the interior found new pathways to the surface, pouring out in the great floods of lava that transformed the ancient climate. The breaking of the world and the catastrophes that shaped the dinosaurs were, in a deep sense, two faces of the same vast process, the restless churning of the living planet. As the supercontinent began to break apart, new seas were born in the widening rifts. Where the land split, water rushed in, first as narrow channels, then as broadening seaways, then, across the long ages, as wide oceans. The single great ocean that had surrounded the all-land was joined by new oceans growing in the heart of the breaking continent. And these new seas changed the climate, for they brought the moisture of the ocean closer to lands that had long been dry, watering the interior and softening the harsh extremes of the old continental climate. This too played its part in the great age of rain, the new seaways carrying moisture deep into lands that had been desert, helping to drown the dry interior in the transforming water. For the dinosaurs, the slow breaking of the world had profound consequences, though these would unfold across ages far longer than the dinosaurs' origin, stretching across the whole of their long reign. In the early days, while the land was still largely joined, the dinosaurs could spread freely across the whole of the world, walking from one end of the supercontinent to the other, and so the early dinosaurs are found on lands that are now scattered across the globe, carried apart by the drifting continents in the ages since. But as the supercontinent broke apart, as the new seas widened and the land separated, the dinosaurs of different continents became isolated from one another. And isolation, in the great workshop of evolution, drives the making of new forms. Cut off from their relatives by the widening seas, the dinosaurs of each separating landmass began to evolve along their own paths, adapting to their own particular conditions, diverging into their own distinct forms. The breaking of the world thus became an engine of dinosaur diversity, dividing the great family of dinosaurs into separate branches that grew and flourished in isolation until the world was filled with a tremendous variety of dinosaur kinds, each suited to its own corner of the fragmenting earth. There is something deeply moving in this slow breaking of the world, this patient drifting of the continents across the ages, for it means that the very ground beneath our feet, the continents we think of as fixed and eternal, are in truth travellers, wanderers, slowly drifting across the face of the planet, carried by forces deep within the earth. The lands that held the early dinosaurs have since drifted thousands of miles from where they began, carried apart and rearranged into the continents we know today. The bones of dinosaurs found in lands now separated by vast oceans were once buried in a single continuous landmass, before the slow breaking of the world carried them apart. And the breaking continues even now, imperceptibly, the continents still drifting, the ocean still widening or narrowing, the great slow dance going on as it has for ages beyond counting, and will go on for ages yet to come. To contemplate this is to feel the deep patience of the earth, the immense slowness of its great processes, against which even the long reign of the dinosaurs seems brief. The continents drift at the pace of growing fingernails, and yet across the ages they cross the whole face of the world. The mountains rise grain by grain, and erode grain by grain, and yet across the ages whole ranges are born and worn away to nothing. The seas open and close, the climates shift, the very poles wander, all at a pace too slow for any creature to perceive, and yet relentless, unceasing, reshaping the world again and again across the long unfolding of time. There is no haste in the deep earth, no urgency, only the patient working of vast forces across immeasurable spans of time, and there is a deep peace in this, a peace worth carrying into sleep, the peace of the slow and patient world, turning and changing at its own unhurried pace, indifferent to all hurry, eternal in its slow becoming. So rest now, and let the slow breaking of the world drift gently through your mind. Feel the great supercontinent beginning to crack and rift, the new seas growing in the widening gaps, the lands beginning their long, slow drift across the face of the planet. Feel the deep patience of it, the immense unhurried slowness of the moving earth. There is no hurry in the deep world, no urgency, no rush. There is only the slow and patient turning of the ages, the gentle drift of continents, the unhurried working of vast and ancient forces. Let that deep patience settle over you now. Let go of all hurry and all haste. Feel yourself held in the slow and patient rhythm of the deep earth, the rhythm that moves continents and opens oceans and shapes the world across the longest of ages. Breathe slowly as the drifting continents, and let the patient earth carry you, gently and without hurry, down into the deep country of sleep. When the great rains had ended and the world had settled into its new and calmer shape, the dinosaurs came fully into their inheritance. The age that followed, the long age of dinosaur dominance that stretched across the Jurassic and beyond, was a world unlike any that had come before, a world shaped by the dinosaurs and shaped for them, a green and teeming world in which these wonderful creatures reached the fullness of their greatness. Let us spend a gentle while in this world the dinosaurs made, walking through its forests and across its plains, that we might see what grew from the small beginnings we have traced through this long story. Picture a forest of the early Jurassic, in the ages after the rains had passed. It is a forest of conifers, tall and straight, their needled branches forming a high green canopy through which the sunlight falls in soft golden shafts. There are tree ferns in the understory, and cycads with their stiff radiating crowns, and ground ferns spreading across the forest floor. There are no flowers still, for the flowering plants have not yet come, and there is no grass, and so the forest floor is carpeted instead with ferns and mosses and the litter of fallen needles. The air is warm and clear, far clearer than the heavy humid air of the great rains, and it carries the clean sharp scent of conifer resin and the green smell of growing things. It is a beautiful world, this early Jurassic forest, peaceful and abundant, bathed in golden light. And through this forest move the dinosaurs, no longer the small marginal creatures of the Triassic, but the established lords of the land, grown into a tremendous variety of forms. There, browsing among the high branches, moves a long-necked plant-eater, larger now than its Triassic ancestors, reaching up to crop the tender needles at the tops of the trees. It moves slowly and peacefully, this gentle giant, its long neck sweeping gracefully through the canopy, its great body supported on legs like pillars. Nearby, a group of smaller plant-eaters grazes on the ferns of the understory, moving together in a loose herd, watchful but unhurried. And at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, a predator watches, lean and alert, its eyes moving over the herd, choosing perhaps its moment. But there is no urgency in the scene, no tension, only the slow, peaceful rhythm of the ancient forest, the browsing of the plant-eaters, and the patient watching of the hunter, and the soft golden light falling through the high green canopy. The dinosaurs of this established age had grown into every conceivable role. There were the great long-necked giants, the sauropods, growing ever larger across the ages until some of them became the most massive creatures ever to walk the dry land, their necks sweeping high into the treetops, their bodies vast beyond easy imagining. There were the two-legged plant-eaters, swift and alert, moving in herds across the plains and through the forests. There were the armoured dinosaurs, plated and spiked, lumbering slowly through the underbrush, protected from all but the greatest predators by their bony defences. And there were the predators themselves, the meat-eating dinosaurs, ranging from small swift hunters that pursued the little creatures of the forest floor to great fearsome beasts that could bring down even the large plant-eaters. The dinosaurs filled the world, occupying every role that large land animals could occupy, dominating the land as no group of creatures had ever dominated it before. And the world they made was a world that worked, a rich and balanced and functioning world, humming along through the long ages of their dominance. The plants grew and were eaten by the plant-eaters, and the plant-eaters were hunted by the predators, and the dead of all kinds were broken down and recycled by the small creatures and the insects and the patient processes of decay, returning their substance to the soil to feed the growth of new plants. The great wheel of life turned, season by season, and age by age, the energy of the sun captured by the green plants and passed up through the web of life and returned at last to the earth, in an endless cycle of growth and consumption and renewal. The dinosaurs were the great and visible lords of this world, but they were also part of it, woven into the great web of life, dependent on the plants and the soil and the sun and the rain, just as every creature is dependent on the world that sustains it. The climate of this established dinosaur age was warm, far warmer than the world of today, with no great ice caps at the poles and forests growing even in the high latitudes. It was a green world, a lush world, a world of abundant plant life and teeming animal life, watered by seasonal rains but never again drowned as it had been in the great age of rain. The seasons turned, wet and dry, warm and cool, in a gentler rhythm than the harsh extremes of the old supercontinental climate, for the breaking apart of the lands and the growth of the new seas had softened the climate, bringing the moderating influence of the ocean to lands that had once been harsh and dry. It was, in many ways, a kind world, this dinosaur world, a world well suited to the flourishing of life, and life flourished in it tremendously across the long ages of the dinosaurs' reign. And life flourished not only on the land but in the air and in the seas as well. In the skies above, the dinosaur forests wheeled the pterosaurs, those flying reptiles who had first taken to the air in the age of rain, now grown into a great variety of forms, some small and swift, others growing toward the tremendous sizes their descendants would achieve. They soared on their membrane wings above the canopy, hunting insects in the air or fish in the waters below, masters of a realm that no creature with a backbone had entered before their kind. And in the seas, the marine reptiles ruled. The sleek fish-shaped ichthyosaurs and the long-necked plesiosaurs and all their kin, hunting through the waters that the breaking of the world had opened. Lords of the ocean, as the dinosaurs were lords of the land. The whole world teemed with life, in the air and on the land and in the sea, a great flourishing of creatures across every realm, all of it grown from the survivors of the ancient catastrophes, all of it shaped by the long, slow processes that we have traced through this story. And in the margins of this teeming world, small and quiet and easy to overlook, the mammals lived their patient lives. They were still small, these early mammals, still cautious, still mostly creatures of the night, scurrying through the undergrowth while the great dinosaurs ruled the day. They ate insects and seeds and small creatures, and they raised their young in burrows and hidden places, and they kept to the shadows, biding their time across the long ages. They had gathered their gifts in the age of rain, the warm blood and the fur and the tender care of their young, and they carried those gifts forward through the long reign of the dinosaurs, waiting, all unknowing, for the day when their own moment would come. There is something deeply touching in the patience of these early mammals, these small ancestors of ours, keeping faithfully to the margins for 100 million years and more, carrying within them the seeds of a future that none of them could imagine. Their day would come in the great fullness of time. But for now, in the established dinosaur age, they waited, small and quiet, in the shadow of the giants. So rest now, and let the world the dinosaurs made unfold gently around you. See the golden light falling through the high green canopy of the conifer forest. See the long-necked giants browsing peacefully among the treetops. See the herds of plant-eaters moving through the ferns, and the patient predators watching from the shadows, and the pterosaurs wheeling in the warm clear sky above. See the whole green and teeming world, humming along in its slow peaceful rhythm, the great wheel of life turning season by season and age by age. And see, in the quiet margins, the small mammals keeping their patient watch, biding their time in the shadow of the giants. It is a beautiful world, this world the dinosaurs made, a world of abundance and peace and slow-turning life. Let it cradle you now, this golden ancient world. Breathe slowly, let the warm light and the green forest and the gentle giants soothe you, and rest deeply and peacefully in the world the dinosaurs made. We have walked through the wet world by day, through its dim grey light and its endless falling rain, but we have not yet known it by night, and there is a particular peace in the ancient darkness that is worth seeking out as we drift towards sleep. So let us return one final time to the great age of rain, and let us stay this time as the dim light fades and the long wet night comes down over the drowned and dreaming world. The light of the wet world was never bright, even at the height of day, for the heavy grey ceiling of cloud forever softened and dimmed the sun. And so the coming of night was not the sudden falling of darkness that we know, but a slow and gentle dimming, the soft grey light fading by imperceptible degrees into a deeper and deeper gloom, until at last the world was wrapped in a darkness so complete that you could not see your own hand before your face. There were no city lights in this ancient world, no glow upon the horizon, no scattered stars to pierce the dark, for the clouds hid the heavens utterly. There was only the deep and total darkness of a world before any human eye, a darkness older and purer than any we will ever know. And in that darkness the sounds of the wet world rose up to fill the night. By day, the rain and the rushing rivers had dominated the world of sound. But by night, when the rains often softened to a gentle drizzle, or paused altogether, other sounds emerged. There was the steady drip of water falling from a million leaves, a soft and constant patter, like the gentlest of rains continuing long after the rain itself had stopped. There was the murmur and gurgle of the streams and the rivers, flowing endlessly through the dark. And there was the great chorus of the night creatures, rising up from every pool and every thicket, the calls of the amphibians gathered to breed in the warm wet darkness, a vast and layered symphony of croaks and trills and pulses, filling the night with the music of life. The insects too filled the wet night with their sounds and their soft presence. The warm humid darkness was alive with them, the whir of wings, the chirp and buzz of countless small creatures going about their lives in the dark. Some of them, perhaps, gave off a soft glow, as some insects do even today, tiny points of living light drifting through the blackness, the only lights in all that ancient dark. Imagine them, these faint and drifting glimmers, the soft luminous dance of glowing insects above the dark and dreaming pools, the only stars in a world whose true stars were hidden behind the clouds. There is something almost unbearably beautiful in the thought of it, these tiny living lights, glowing softly in the deep dark of a world 230 million years gone. And through this warm, dark, wet night, the creatures of the ancient world moved and rested. The dinosaurs, after the long day's foraging, sheltered now in whatever cover they could find, drowsing through the dark hours, their bodies warm with the inner fire that set them apart from the colder creatures of their world. Perhaps they slept much as birds sleep, their descendants, with that light and watchful rest, ready to wake at any threat. Perhaps the small ones huddled together for warmth and safety, and the large ones rested in the open, secure in their size. We cannot know the particulars, but we can imagine them, these ancient creatures at their rest, drowsing through the warm, dark night of the wet world, just as you are drowsing now through the night of your own world, so many ages later. The small mammals, our own ancestors, were perhaps more active in the dark, for many of them were creatures of the night, and the darkness was their time. They emerged from their burrows and their hidden places and went about their small business in the warm dark, hunting for insects, foraging for seeds, their large eyes and sensitive whiskers and keen ears guiding them through the blackness that the dinosaurs could not navigate so well. The night belonged to them, in a sense, this small early kingdom of the dark, while the great creatures of the day slept. And in that nocturnal kingdom, across the long ages, the mammals refined the senses and the warm blood and the quick wits that would one day, in the great fullness of time, serve their descendants so well. There is a deep peace in this ancient night, a peace that reaches across the ages to soothe us now. For the night has always been a time of rest, across all the long history of life, a time when the world grows quiet and dark, and the creatures of the day lay down their burdens and sleep. The dinosaurs slept in the warm dark nights of the wet world. The small mammals rested in their turn through the bright days. Every creature that has ever lived has known the rhythm of waking and rest, of day and night, of activity and sleep. It is one of the oldest rhythms of life, older than the dinosaurs, older than the first creatures to crawl upon the land, as old as life itself upon a turning world. And you are part of that ancient rhythm now, as you lie here in the dark, your own day's burdens laid down, your own rest coming over you, in the same eternal pattern that the dinosaurs knew, and the mammals knew, and every living creature has known since the world began. So let the ancient night come down around you now, soft and warm and deep. Hear the gentle dripping of water from the leaves, the soft murmur of the streams, the distant chorus of the night creatures rising from the pools. See the faint and drifting lights of the glowing insects, the only stars in the deep dark. Feel the warm, humid darkness wrapping around you like the softest of blankets. And know that you are part of the oldest rhythm of life, the rhythm of rest that the dinosaurs knew in their warm, dark nights so long ago. The day is done, the burdens are laid down, the night has come, the deep and ancient night, the night that has cradled every living creature since the dawn of life. Breathe slowly, let the warm dark take you, and rest as the dinosaurs rested in the deep peace of the ancient night. The rise of the dinosaurs, as we have seen, was not the work of a single moment, but the slow unfolding of an age, driven by the great rains and the turning of the world. But there was one final threshold that the dinosaurs had to cross before their dominance was truly secure, one last great upheaval that swept away the last of their rivals and opened the way to the long golden age of their reign. It came at the very end of the Triassic period, around 200 million years ago, and though it was another catastrophe, we will walk through it gently, as we have walked through all the catastrophes of this story, knowing that life endured, and that from this last upheaval, the dinosaurs emerged triumphant and unchallenged. To understand this last threshold, we must remember the world as it stood near the end of the Triassic. The great rains had passed, and the world had settled into its calmer shape. The dinosaurs had risen and were flourishing, dominant now across much of the land. But they were not yet entirely without rivals. The great archosaurs of the crocodile line, though much diminished from their former glory, had not entirely vanished. Some of them still held on, still occupied certain roles, still competed with the dinosaurs in certain places. The world was the dinosaurs' world mostly, but not yet completely. There remained these last holdouts of the old order, these surviving cousins from the crocodile branch of the great archosaur family, clinging to their diminished place in a world that had largely moved on without them. And then, at the very end of the Triassic, the Earth convulsed once more. As the great supercontinent continued its slow breaking apart, a new and tremendous burst of volcanic activity erupted along the widening rift that was splitting the land, in the region that would one day separate the Americas from Africa and Europe. This was one of the largest outpourings of lava in all the history of the planet, a vast flood basalt eruption that poured molten rock across an enormous area and once again vented great quantities of carbon and other gases into the sky. And once again, the consequences rippled across the whole world. The climate lurched, the temperatures swung, the chemistry of the oceans was thrown into turmoil, and many creatures, unable to endure the sudden upheaval, faded into extinction. This end-Triassic extinction was a true mass extinction, one of the great die-offs in the history of life, though it was not so severe as the great dying that had come before it. Many groups of creatures suffered grievously. In the seas, many kinds of marine life perished. On the land, the toll fell heavily upon precisely those last holdouts of the old order, the surviving great archosaurs of the crocodile line who had competed with the dinosaurs. They were swept away, most of them, in this final upheaval, their long lineages coming at last to their end. And the dinosaurs, adaptable and resilient as ever, came through. Once more, when the world convulsed, it was the dinosaurs who endured, while their rivals fell. Once more, the catastrophe cleared the way, removing the last competitors, opening the last spaces, leaving the world to the dinosaurs alone. Why did the dinosaurs survive this last threshold when so many others did not? The same reasons, perhaps, that had carried them through all the upheavals before: their adaptability, their efficient bodies, their flexible ways of living, their warm blood, and their efficient lungs and their upright stance, all the gifts that had served them so well through all the changes of the long Triassic. Whatever the precise reasons, the result was clear. When the dust settled and the world stabilized once more, at the dawn of the Jurassic period, the dinosaurs stood essentially unchallenged upon the land. The last of their great rivals were gone. The roles they had once had to compete for now lay open before them, and into those open roles the dinosaurs surged, diversifying and growing as never before, expanding to fill every corner of the land, beginning the long golden age that would see them grow into the greatest land creatures the world had ever known. It is striking, when you step back and survey the whole long story, How many times catastrophe served the dinosaurs? The great dying cleared the old world and allowed the rise of the archosaurs from whom the dinosaurs would spring. The great rains transformed the world and allowed the dinosaurs to rise above their archosaur rivals. And now this last great extinction at the end of the Triassic swept away the final holdouts and left the world to the dinosaurs alone. 3 times the world convulsed, and 3 times the dinosaurs emerged stronger than before. There is a lesson in this, perhaps, about the strange ways that fortune works, how the very upheavals that destroy so much can also clear the way for new flourishing, how catastrophe and opportunity are so often 2 faces of the same event. The dinosaurs did not cause these catastrophes, of course. They simply happened to be the kind of creature that could endure them and profit from them, the adaptable inheritors of a world repeatedly remade by disaster. And so, at the dawn of the Jurassic, the long origin of the dinosaurs was complete. The journey that had begun with small, overlooked creatures darting through the ferns of the Triassic had reached its destination. The dinosaurs were now the undisputed lords of the land, poised at the threshold of their golden age, ready to grow into the magnificent variety of forms that would fill the world for the next 130 million years and more. Everything that would come after, all the great dinosaurs that would ever live, the towering sauropods and the fearsome predators and the horned and armoured and crested giants, all of it grew from this moment, from the world swept clean by the end Triassic extinction and inherited at last by the triumphant dinosaurs. The origin was complete, the golden age was about to begin. We will not follow the dinosaurs into their golden age tonight, for that is another story, a story for another evening, and our journey has reached its natural resting place. We have traced the origin of the dinosaurs from the world before them, through the catastrophes and transformations that shaped them, to the moment of their final triumph. We have seen how they rose from humble beginnings, how the great rains opened the way for them, how they endured the upheavals that destroyed their rivals, how they came at last into their inheritance. It is a complete story, in its way, the story of an origin, the story of how the dinosaurs truly came to be. And it is a fitting place to rest. So rest now, and let the dinosaurs stand triumphant in your mind, at the dawn of their golden age, the long origin complete, the great future stretching out before them. See the last of the old rivals fading away, and the dinosaurs surging into the open world, ready to grow into all the wonderful forms of the ages to come. Feel the satisfaction of a story complete, a journey ended, an origin fulfilled. The dinosaurs have risen, the world is theirs, and the long age of their dominance is about to begin. Let that triumphant image soothe you now, the dinosaurs standing at the threshold of their greatness, the whole magnificent future of their kind stretching out before them like a golden dawn. Breathe slowly, let the story settle into completeness within you, and rest deeply and peacefully at the dawn of the age of dinosaurs. Throughout our journey tonight, we have spoken of millions of years, of hundreds of millions of years, of spans of time so vast that the words slip past us almost without meaning. We say 250 million years, and the number is so large that the mind cannot truly hold it, cannot feel its weight, cannot grasp its depth. And so, let us spend a little while now simply contemplating this vastness, this deep time, for there is a profound and soothing peace in the contemplation of it, a peace that can carry us gently down into sleep. The mind is not built to comprehend deep time. We are creatures of days and seasons and years, of lifetimes measured in decades. We can feel the weight of a single day, the length of a year, perhaps even the span of a human life. But beyond that, our intuitions fail us. 1,000 years is already too much for us to feel. 1,000,000 years is beyond all feeling. And the spans we have spoken of tonight, the hundreds of millions of years across which the dinosaurs rose and reigned, these are utterly beyond our grasp, numbers so vast that they become almost abstract, almost meaningless. And yet, they are real. Every one of those years was a real year, a full turning of the earth around the sun, 365 real days, each one dawning and fading just as your days dawn and fade. The deep past was not a blur, not an abstraction. It was lived, year by year, day by day, by countless creatures across countless ages, each moment as real and as present as this moment is to you now. Let us try gently to feel the depth of it. Imagine that the whole history of the earth, from its fiery birth to this present moment, were compressed into a single year, beginning on the first day of January and ending at the stroke of midnight on the last day of December. On this scale, the Earth forms in the first moments of January. For months and months through the long winter and spring and summer of this imagined year, there is only the slow development of the early Earth, the formation of the oceans, the first stirrings of the simplest life. It is not until the autumn that complex life begins to flourish. The great dying, that catastrophe we walk through tonight, falls in the middle of December. The great rains, the rise of the dinosaurs, all of it falls in the latter half of December. The dinosaurs reign through the final days of the year, falling at last in the final week, and the whole of human existence, every empire and every person who has ever lived, occupies only the final moments before midnight on the last day, a few seconds at the very end of the year. This is the depth of time, the immensity of it, against which the whole of human history is the briefest of flickers, and against which even the long reign of the dinosaurs is only a portion of the final week. And yet, here is the wonder of it. Across all that immensity of time, across all those ages too vast for the mind to hold, the thread of life was never broken. From the first simple stirrings in the early oceans, through all the catastrophes and transformations, through the great dying and the great rains and the rise and fall of the dinosaurs, through the long ages right down to this present moment, life continued, unbroken, generation after generation, in an unimaginably long chain of living and dying and passing on the spark of life. Every creature alive today, including you, stands at the end of that unbroken chain, the latest link in a lineage that stretches back across the whole vast depth of time, back to the very beginning of life upon the earth. You're not separate from the deep past. You're its living continuation, its present expression, the current moment in a story that began billions of years ago and has never once paused. There is a deep peace in feeling this, in placing yourself within the great vastness of time. For our daily worries, our small urgent concerns, the things that press upon us and trouble our rest, all of these shrink to their proper size against the immensity of deep time. The things that seem so large and so pressing in the moment are revealed, against the backdrop of the ages, as the smallest of flickers, here and gone in an instant of geological time. This is not to say that they do not matter, for every moment matters in its way, every life is precious in its time, but there is a comfort in perspective, a release in feeling oneself held within something so much vaster than oneself, in knowing that the great slow processes of the world will continue long after our small concerns have faded, in feeling oneself a part of the great unbroken chain of life that stretches across the whole depth of time. And there is comfort, too, in the patience of deep time, in its slowness, its lack of all hurry. The continents drift at the pace of growing fingernails, and yet across the ages they cross the whole face of the world. The mountains rise and erode grain by grain, and yet across the ages whole ranges are born and worn away. The species rise and fall, the climates shift, the very face of the planet transforms, all at a pace too slow for any single creature to perceive, all in the deep patient rhythm of the ages. There is no hurry in deep time, no urgency, no rush. There is only the slow and patient unfolding of the world, age after age, in its own unhurried rhythm. And to feel that rhythm, to align oneself with that deep slowness, is to find a profound and restful peace, a release from all the hurry and the haste of the small, fast world of human concerns. So let us rest now in the vastness of deep time. Feel the immensity of it stretching out behind you, the billions of years, the countless ages, the unimaginable depth of the past from which you have emerged. Feel yourself held within it, a part of it, the latest link in the unbroken chain of life that reaches back across the whole vast depth of time. Feel your small worries shrink to their proper size against the immensity of the ages, and feel the deep peace of perspective settle over you. And feel the patience of deep time, its slowness, its lack of all hurry, and let that deep patient rhythm soothe you, releasing you from all haste, all urgency, all the small fast cares of the waking world. There is no hurry here in the deep slow country of time. There is only rest and patience and the great unhurried unfolding of the ages. Breathe slowly, as slowly as the drifting continents, as slowly as the rising mountains, as slowly as the deep patient turning of the world, and let the vastness of deep time carry you, gently and without hurry, down into the deep and peaceful country of sleep. Of all the creatures we've met on our journey through the deep past, there is one lineage whose story touches us most nearly, for it is our own. While the dinosaurs rose to their greatness, while they spread across the land and grew into their magnificent forms, another group of creatures lived quietly alongside them, small and overlooked, keeping faithfully to the margins of the world. These were the ancestors of the mammals, and through them, the ancestors of us. Their story is not a story of triumph, not in the age of the dinosaurs, but it is a story of patience, of endurance, of the quiet carrying forward of precious gifts across the longest of ages. And there is a deep tenderness in it, this story of our patient ancestors, that makes a fitting companion to the great drama of the dinosaurs. We have spoken of the cynodonts, those descendants of the old synapsids who survived the Great Dying and lived on through the Triassic. In the early days, some of the cynodonts were creatures of considerable size, predators and plant-eaters of respectable proportions, holding their own in the recovering world. But as the Triassic wore on, as the archosaurs and then the dinosaurs rose to dominance, the cynodonts were pushed steadily towards smaller and smaller sizes, toward more and more marginal ways of living. They could not compete with the great archosaurs and the rising dinosaurs for the large roles, the roles of the great predators and the great plant-eaters. And so they retreated into smallness, into the night, into the spaces between and beneath the world of the giants. But in that retreat something remarkable happened. For as the cynodonts grew smaller and took to the margins, they developed, across the long ages, the very traits that would one day define the mammals and make them so successful. Consider the challenge of being small. A small creature loses heat quickly, for it has a large surface area compared to its small body, and so it must work hard to stay warm. And so the small cynodonts developed ever more efficient ways of generating and retaining heat, refining the warm blood that would become the hallmark of the mammals. They developed fur, that wonderful insulating coat that traps warmth against the body, allowing a small creature to stay warm even in the cool of the night. The warm blood and the fur together freed the small cynodonts from dependence on the sun, allowing them to be active in the cool dark hours when the cold-blooded creatures grew sluggish, opening up the night as a realm where they could live and hunt with little competition. Consider too the challenge of finding food as a small creature in a world of giants. The small cynodonts could not bring down large prey, could not browse the high branches, could not compete for the great food sources of the world. And so they specialized in the small things, in insects and seeds and tiny creatures, in the abundant small foods that the giants overlooked. And to make the most of these small foods, they developed sophisticated teeth, teeth of varied shapes for varied tasks, teeth that could cut and crush and grind, far more versatile than the simple teeth of most reptiles. They developed sharper senses, keen hearing, and a fine sense of smell and sensitive whiskers to find their small prey in the dark. And they developed larger brains relative to their bodies to process all this sensory information and to navigate the complex challenges of their small and watchful lives. And consider, most touchingly of all, the challenge of raising young as a small creature in a dangerous world. The small cynodonts could not produce great numbers of offspring and trust to chance that some would survive, the way many creatures do. They were too small, too vulnerable, their young too fragile. And so they invested deeply in fewer offspring, guarding them and tending them, and, in time, feeding them from their own bodies. The beginnings of the milk that would become the defining feature of the mammals, the very thing from which the mammals take their name. The tender care of the young, the close bond between mother and offspring, the deep investment in the next generation, all of this developed among our small patient ancestors in the long ages of the dinosaurs in the margins of the world. So while the dinosaurs grew great and magnificent and filled the world with their tremendous forms, our own ancestors grew small and subtle and sophisticated, gathering in the shadows the gifts of warm blood and fur and sharp senses and large brains and tender care. They did not rule, they did not dominate, they kept to the margins, to the night, to the small spaces between the feet of the giants. For 100 million years and more through the whole long golden age of the dinosaurs, they waited, patient and persistent, carrying their precious gifts forward across the ages. It must have seemed, if creatures can be said to perceive such things, that the world would belong to the dinosaurs forever, that the small mammals would forever keep to the shadows, forever wait for a day that would never come. But the day did come at last. For the dinosaurs, mighty as they were not eternal, as nothing in this story is eternal. And when the great asteroid struck the Earth 66 million years ago, and the long reign of the great dinosaurs came to its sudden end, it was the small patient mammals who were ready to inherit the transformed world. Their smallness, which had kept them in the margins for so long, now became their salvation, for small creatures could survive on little, could shelter in burrows, could endure the terrible aftermath of the asteroid in ways that the great dinosaurs could not. And when the world began to recover, the mammals emerged from their long patience and rushed into the spaces left empty by the fallen giants, and they diversified, and they grew, and they spread, and they rose at last to a dominance of their own. All the gifts they had gathered in the long ages of waiting, the warm blood and the fur and the sharp senses and the large brains and the tender care, all of it now served them magnificently as they rose to fill the world. And from among those rising mammals in the great fullness of time came the primates, the clever tree-dwelling creatures with their grasping hands and their forward-facing eyes and their ever larger brains. And from among the primates came our own ancestors, who came down from the trees and stood upright upon the plains and learned to make tools and to use fire and to speak and to dream. And from them came us, the latest expression of that long patient lineage, the heirs of all those small creatures who waited so faithfully in the shadow of the dinosaurs for so very long, every gift that makes us what we are, the warmth of our blood, the care we give our children, the sharpness of our senses, the size of our brains, all of it was first gathered by our small patient ancestors in the margins of the world in the long ages of the dinosaurs. There is something deeply moving in this, deeply comforting, as you lie here in the dark. For it means that patience is not weakness, that to wait in the margins is not to fail, that the quiet and overlooked may yet inherit the world in the fullness of time. Our ancestors waited for 100 million years and more, small and patient in the shadow of the giants, and their patience was rewarded at last beyond all imagining. The gifts they gathered in those long ages of waiting became the foundation of all that we are, and so we are, all of us, the children of patience, the heirs of endurance, the descendants of those small, faithful creatures who carried the spark of our lineage forward through the longest of nights toward a dawn they could never have imagined. So rest now, and hold your patient ancestors gently in your thoughts. The small cynodonts, retreating into smallness and into the night, the early mammals gathering their gifts in the margins of the world, the long ages of patient waiting through the whole golden age of the dinosaurs, and the great inheritance that came at last, the rise of the mammals, the dawn of the primates, the long, slow emergence of humankind. Feel your deep connection to these patient ancestors, these small, faithful creatures who waited so long and carried so much. Feel the warmth of your own blood, the gift they gathered in the cool, dark nights of the ancient world. Feel the great patience that runs in your lineage, the deep endurance that brought you at last to this quiet moment of rest. Breathe slowly, let the tenderness of this story settle over you. And rest, secure in the knowledge that you are the heir of patience, the child of endurance, the latest expression of a lineage that waited faithfully through the longest of ages for the dawn that came at last. When we walked through the great dying, that terrible catastrophe that very nearly ended life upon the earth, we spoke of the survivors, the few creatures who endured when so many perished. But we passed quickly over them, hurrying on through the great drama of destruction and recovery. Let us return now, gently, to those survivors and to the refugees where they sheltered, for there is a deep and quiet beauty in these places of endurance, these small corners where life held on against all the odds, and there is comfort in dwelling on them as we drift towards sleep. When a catastrophe sweeps across the world, it does not fall everywhere with equal force. There are always places that are spared, or spared somewhat, corners of the world where the conditions remain just barely livable, while everywhere else grows hostile to life. Scientists call these places refuges, or by an older and more beautiful word, refugia, the places of refuge where life takes shelter and waits out the worst of the storm. And in the great dying, as in all the great catastrophes, it was in such refuges that the survivors endured, holding on through the long dark ages until the world began to heal. Where were these refuges in the time of the Great Dying? Some of them, it seems, were near the poles, far from the burning equator, where the warming that devastated the tropics was less severe, and where the cooler conditions remained for a time within the limits that life could bear. Imagine such a place. A cool coastal refuge near the ancient South Pole, far from the worst of the catastrophe. The world beyond is dying, the tropics turn to lethal deserts, the sea suffocating, the land laid waste. But here, in this cool far corner, conditions remain just barely livable. The plants still grow, though sparsely, the streams still flow. And here a remnant of life takes shelter, a few hardy creatures clinging to existence, waiting out the long catastrophe, all unknowing that upon their endurance hangs the entire future of life upon the land. Other refugees perhaps were in the highlands, in cooler mountain regions where the heat of the warming world was tempered by altitude. Others may have been along certain coasts where cool ocean currents kept the local conditions livable, or in deep valleys with their own particular climates, or in scattered pockets where some local mercy of geography held back the worst of the devastation. We cannot map these ancient refugees with certainty, for they are hidden in the deep past, but we know they must have existed, for life survived, and life can only survive where conditions allow. Somewhere, in scattered corners of the dying world, the conditions allowed, and there life sheltered and endured. And what was it like to be a survivor in those refuges through the long, dark ages of the catastrophe? It must have been a hard and narrow existence, a life lived on the edge of survival, in a world stripped down to its barest bones. The survivors were not thriving. They were enduring, holding on, making do with the meagre resources of a ruined world. The plants that survived were the hardiest and the most adaptable, the ones that could endure the harsh conditions, growing sparse and stunted in the poisoned soil. The animals that survived were the toughest and the most flexible, the ones that could make do with little, that could endure the heat or the cold or the scarcity, that could find food where there was almost none to find. It was a grim existence, a bare survival, a holding on through the longest and darkest of nights. And yet, in that grim endurance lay the entire future of life. For these survivors, hard-pressed and few as they were, carried within them the seed of all the life that was to come. The few reptiles that survived would give rise, across the ages, to the archosaurs and the dinosaurs and the birds. The few synapsids that survived would give rise to the cynodonts and the mammals and, in the great fullness of time, to us. The few plants that survived would reseed the world and rebuild the forests. The few sea creatures that survived would repopulate the oceans. Everything that came after, every creature that would ever live, traced its ancestry back through these few hard-pressed survivors, these enduring remnants sheltering in the scattered refugees of the dying world. The whole vast future of life hung for a time on the endurance of these few, in these few places, through these darkest of ages. There is a profound lesson in this, and a profound comfort. For it tells us that life does not need much to carry on. It does not need the whole world to flourish. It needs only a few survivors, in a few refugees, holding on through the worst of times. Given that bare minimum, given a few enduring remnants and the time to recover, life will always rebuild, will always diversify, will always fill the world again with its endless creativity. The Great Dying reduced the living world to a fraction of its former abundance, swept away the great majority of all species, brought life closer to extinction than it has ever come before or since. And yet, from those few survivors in those few refuges, life rebuilt itself entirely and went on to produce the dinosaurs and the mammals and the birds and all the wonderful abundance of the world that followed. The refuges held, life endured, and from the smallest of remnants grew the greatest of recoveries. This is the deepest comfort of the whole long story, perhaps, the comfort to carry most closely into sleep, that life is resilient beyond all imagining, that it can endure the very worst that the world can throw at it, that even when it is reduced to the barest remnant sheltering in scattered refugees through the darkest of ages, it holds on and recovers and flourishes once more. The world has ended, very nearly, more than once, and every time life has found its refuges, endured its dark ages, and risen again to fill the world anew. There is no catastrophe so great that life cannot recover from it, given a few survivors and the gift of time, and you, lying here in the dark, are the proof of it, the living heir of all those survivors, the descendant of the remnants that sheltered in the refugees through all the catastrophes of the deep past. The refuges held for you. Life endured for you. And here you are, at the end of it all, breathing softly in the quiet dark, the living testament to the deep resilience of life. So rest now, and hold the refuges of life gently in your thoughts. The cool far corners near the ancient poles, where life took shelter from the burning world, the highland sanctuaries and the sheltered valleys and the scattered pockets of endurance, the few hard-pressed survivors holding on through the longest of nights, carrying within them the whole future of life, and the great recovery that came at last, life rising again from the smallest of remnants to fill the world anew. Feel the deep resilience of life, its power to endure the very worst and to recover and to flourish once more. Feel your own connection to those ancient survivors, your own inheritance of their deep endurance, and take comfort, the deepest comfort, in the knowledge that life always finds its refuges, always endures its dark ages, always rises again. The refuges held, life endured, and here you are, safe and warm in the quiet dark, the living heir of all that endurance. Breathe slowly, let the deep resilience of life settle over you like a warm and protecting blanket, and rest, secure and peaceful, in the long, safe keeping of enduring life. We have spoken often of the animals of the deep past, of the synapsids and the archosaurs and the dinosaurs, but we have given less attention to the plants, the quiet green foundation upon which all that animal life depended. And yet the plants of the ancient world were every bit as strange and wonderful as the animals, and the green world they made was as alien to our eyes as any landscape on a distant planet. So let us wander now through the ancient forests, slowly and gently, and dwell on the strange green world that was, before the world we know took shape. The first thing you would notice walking through the forests of the Triassic is what is missing. There are no flowers, not one. The whole world is without flowers, for the flowering plants have not yet evolved, and will not appear for another 100 million years. There are no bright blossoms anywhere, no roses or lilies or daisies, no colourful petals opening to the sun. The world is green and brown, the colours of leaf and bark and earth, without the bright splashes of colour that flowers would one day bring, and there is no grass beneath your feet, for the grasses too belong to a distant future. The ground is not carpeted in the soft green turf we know, but covered instead in ferns and mosses and the litter of fallen fronds, or else left bare, the open soil between the plants. It is a world that would look to our eyes somehow incomplete, somehow unfinished, lacking the flowers and the grasses that we take for granted as the basic furniture of the living world. What the ancient world had instead were older kinds of plants, plants that have largely vanished from our world, or survive only in scattered remnants. There were the ferns, of course, in tremendous variety, from low ground-hugging kinds to great tree ferns that rose on slender trunks to spread their fronds high overhead. The tree ferns are among the most beautiful of the ancient plants, their trunks rough and fibrous, their crowns a great spreading rosette of feathery green fronds, casting a dappled shade upon the forest floor. A few tree ferns survive in our world still, in tropical forests, and to stand among them is to catch a glimpse of the ancient green world, to see something very like what the dinosaurs saw. There were the cycads, those strange plants with their stout trunks and their crowns of stiff, radiating palm-like leaves. The cycads were tremendously abundant in the age of the dinosaurs, so abundant that some scientists have called that age the age of cycads as much as the age of dinosaurs. They produce great cones, some of them enormous, holding their seeds. A few cycads too survive in our world, scattered relics of a vanished abundance, and they have a strange and ancient look about them, a look that speaks of the deep past from which they came. There were the ginkgos, with their distinctive fan-shaped leaves, a kind of tree that was once widespread across the ancient world, and that survives today in only a single species, the ginkgo tree that is sometimes planted along city streets. To see a ginkgo tree, with its fan-shaped leaves turning golden in the autumn, is to look upon a living fossil, a survivor from the age of the dinosaurs, a tree whose ancestors shaded the dinosaurs themselves. There is something wonderful in that such ancient trees still grow among us, carrying the deep past forward into the present. And there were the conifers, the cone-bearing trees that came to dominate the forests of the dinosaur age, the ancestors of the pines and firs and spruces and redwoods of our own world. These were perhaps the most successful of the ancient plants, spreading across the world in great forests, providing food and shelter for countless creatures. Some of them grew to tremendous sizes, towering trees that formed high green canopies, much like the great conifer forests that survive in parts of our world today. To walk through such a forest, among the tall, straight trunks, beneath the high green canopy, breathing the clean, sharp scent of conifer resin, is to walk in a forest much like those the dinosaurs knew, for the conifers have endured, little changed, across all the long ages since. And there were the horsetails, those strange segmented plants with their hollow jointed stems, which grew along the waterways in dense thickets. In the ancient world, some horsetails grew to tremendous sizes, far larger than the small horsetails that survive in damp places today, forming reed-like forests along the rivers and the swamps. There were club mosses too, and other ancient plants whose like has largely vanished from the world, a whole green kingdom of forms that flourished in the deep past and has since faded into the smallest of remnants. The forests these plants made were unlike any forest we know. They had the tall trunks and the high canopies of a forest, yes, but they were made of these older, stranger plants, the tree ferns and the cycads and the ginkgos and the conifers and the giant horsetails. There were no broadleaf flowering trees, no oaks or maples or beeches, for these belonged to the later world of the flowering plants. There were no fruits as we know them, no berries or apples or nuts in their familiar forms, for these too came with the flowering plants. The ancient forests were green and dim and strange, beautiful in their own way but profoundly different from the forests of our own age, a green world built from plants that have mostly vanished. A vanished green world that we can only glimpse through the fossils and through the scattered living relics that survive. And how strange and wonderful it is to think that all the great drama of the deep past, all the rise and fall of the dinosaurs, all the catastrophes and transformations we have walked through tonight, unfolded against the backdrop of this alien green world. The dinosaurs browsed among the cycads and the tree ferns. They sheltered beneath the conifers and the ginkgos. They moved through forests built from plants that we would scarcely recognize, in a world without flowers, without grass, without the familiar green furniture of our own age. The whole long age of the dinosaurs was lived in a green world utterly unlike our own, and to truly imagine the dinosaurs, we must imagine them in their proper setting among these strange and ancient plants, in the alien green world that was. There is a quiet beauty in this strangeness, this otherworldliness of the ancient green world. It reminds us how much the world has changed, how different the deep past truly was, how the familiar furniture of our own world, the flowers and the grasses and the broad-leaved trees, are themselves relatively recent arrivals that came long after the dinosaurs had risen. The world we know is not the only world that has been. There have been other worlds, green in different ways, built from different plants, stranger and older than our own. And those worlds were real and beautiful and full of life, every bit as much as our own world is. To contemplate them is to feel the deep richness of the past, the many different forms the living world has taken across the long ages, the endless creativity of life in clothing the earth in green. So rest now, and let the ancient green world unfold gently around you. See the tall tree ferns with their spreading crowns of feathery fronds. See the cycads with their stiff radiating leaves and their great cones. See the ginkgos with their fan-shaped leaves, and the towering conifers forming their high green canopies, and the giant horsetails growing in dense thickets along the ancient waterways. See the dinosaurs moving peacefully among these strange and beautiful plants, in a world without flowers, without grass, green in its own ancient way. Feel the deep strangeness and the deep beauty of this vanished green world, this alien forest that sheltered the dinosaurs through all the long ages of their reign. Let its quiet beauty soothe you now, the soft, dim green light, the gentle rustle of ancient fronds, the clean, sharp scent of primeval forests. Breathe slowly, let the ancient green world cradle you. And rest deeply and peacefully in the green world that was. We have come very far together tonight, across an immensity of time, through worlds upon worlds, and as our journey draws toward its close, let us pause and gather the whole long story into a single gentle gaze, that we might see it whole before we let it carry us into sleep. For there is a deep satisfaction in seeing a great story whole, in feeling all its parts come together into one unfolding pattern, and there is no greater story than the story of how the dinosaurs came to be. It began in a world we would scarcely recognize, a single great supercontinent surrounded by a single great ocean, ruled by the strange mammal-like synapsids, clothed in forests of seed ferns and primitive conifers, baking in the harsh light of an ancient sun. That world had found its difficult balance, its harsh and functioning order, and it might have continued in that way for ages. But the deep earth stirred, and the great volcanoes of the far north awoke, and the world was very nearly ended in the catastrophe we call the Great Dying. Almost all of life perished, but not all. In scattered refuges, a remnant endured, and from that remnant, given time, life rebuilt itself anew. The world that emerged was a world of empty spaces, swept clean by catastrophe, waiting to be filled. And into those spaces rose new creatures, the great archosaurs, the ruling reptiles, who dominated the recovering Triassic world. Among them, small and overlooked, the first dinosaurs appeared, modest creatures making their way in the margins of a world ruled by others. They possessed certain gifts, the upright stance and the efficient lungs and the warm blood and the flexible ways, but in the stable dry world of the early Triassic, these gifts counted for little, and the dinosaurs remained a minor presence, a footnote easy to overlook. And then the world changed again, in one of the strangest events in all its history. The deep earth stirred once more, the great volcanoes awoke once more, and this time the warming world filled the sky with moisture, and the rains came, and they fell in their pulses and their surges for something close to 2 million years. The great age of rain transformed the world utterly, drowning the deserts, dissolving the old forests, reshaping the living world from one end to the other, and in that transformed world the gifts of the dinosaurs proved their worth at last. The adaptable inherited the earth. The old rulers faded, and the dinosaurs rose, surging into the spaces left empty by the fallen, diversifying with astonishing speed, growing into the dominant creatures of the land. The rains ended, in time, and the world settled into a new and calmer shape, and the dinosaurs came fully into their inheritance. A last great catastrophe at the end of the Triassic swept away the final holdouts of the old order, and the dinosaurs stood unchallenged, poised at the threshold of their golden age. And then they reigned, for a span of time so vast it defies the imagination, 165 million years of dinosaur dominance, across which they grew into the most magnificent variety of forms the land has ever known, the towering giants and the fearsome hunters, and the horned and armoured and crested wonders, spreading to every continent, adapting to every clime, ruling the world as no creatures had ever ruled it before. And alongside them, all the while, the other heirs of the transformed world flourished too. The pterosaurs claimed the open sky, the crocodiles took to the rivers and the lakes, the marine reptiles ruled the seas, the insects multiplied into countless forms, and in the quiet margins our own ancestors, the small patient mammals, gathered their precious gifts and waited faithfully through the long ages, carrying the seed of our lineage forward toward a dawn they could never imagine. And when the great dinosaurs at last fell 66 million years ago, to the asteroid that ended their reign, it was the small patient mammals who inherited the world, who rose and diversified and grew, who gave rise in time to the primates and to our own ancestors, and at the very end of the long unfolding to us. And the dinosaurs themselves never wholly vanished, for among the feathered dinosaurs one lineage had learned to fly, and those flying dinosaurs, the birds, survived the great catastrophe and live among us still, singing in the trees, crossing the sky on feathered wings, the living heirs of the age of dinosaurs, carrying the ancient lineage forward into the present day. The age of dinosaurs has never truly ended. It has only changed its form. The dinosaurs are all around us still. This is the whole long story, the great unbroken chain from the world before the dinosaurs to the world outside your window tonight, the great dying and the recovery, the rise of the archosaurs and the first small dinosaurs, the great age of rain and the transformation of the world, the triumph of the dinosaurs and the long golden age of their reign, the patient waiting of the mammals and their inheritance at last, and the unbroken thread of life running through all of it, from the deepest past to this present moment, never once broken, carrying the spark of life across all the catastrophes and transformations of the ages, down through the dinosaurs and the mammals and the long, slow emergence of humankind all the way to you, breathing softly in the quiet dark. Consider for a moment how nearly none of it had to happen as it did. Had the volcanoes of the far north slept a little longer, the great dying might never have swept the world clean, and the old synapsids might have ruled for ages more, and the archosaurs might never have risen, and the dinosaurs might never have come to be at all. Had the great rains never fallen, the dinosaurs might have remained forever in the margins, small and overlooked, and faded eventually into extinction, unremembered, their potential never realized. Had the asteroid never struck, the great dinosaurs might be ruling still, and the mammals might still be small and nocturnal, hiding in the undergrowth, and we ourselves might never have emerged at all. At every turn the story might have gone otherwise. There was no destiny in it, no fate written in advance, no guarantee that any of it would unfold as it did. It was all contingent, all dependent on the particular meeting of particular creatures with particular circumstances, the endless dance of chance and fitness playing out across the long ages. And yet it did unfold as it did. Through all those countless turnings, each one balanced on the edge of possibility, until at last it brought forth you, here, now, breathing softly in the dark. There is something almost dizzying in the thought of it, the sheer improbability of your own existence, resting as it does on so vast a chain of ancient happenings, any one of which might have gone another way. And there is something deeply precious in it too, for it means that you, and all of life as it now exists, are not inevitable, but extraordinary, a particular and precious outcome of a particular and unrepeatable history, a wonder that need not have been, and yet, against all the odds, is. It is your story in the end, this great long story of the dinosaurs, for you are its living continuation, the latest link in the unbroken chain, the present expression of a lineage that reaches back across the whole vast depth of time. Every catastrophe that life endured, it endured for you. Every transformation that shaped the living world, it shaped toward you. Every patient ancestor who waited faithfully through the long ages, they waited for you. You are the heir of all of it, the inheritor of the whole long story, the living proof that life endures and that the thread is never broken. And there is no fear in this, only wonder and a deep and abiding peace. The peace of belonging to something so vast and so ancient and so enduring. The peace of being held within the great unbroken story of life. So rest now, and let the whole long story settle gently within you. Feel it as one great unfolding pattern, from the world before the dinosaurs to the world of today. The catastrophes and the recoveries, the risings and the fallings, the unbroken thread of life running through it all. Feel yourself held within that story, a part of it, its living continuation, and feel the deep peace of belonging, the deep comfort of knowing that you are the heir of all that endurance, the inheritor of the whole long story, safe and warm in the quiet dark at the end of the longest of journeys. Breathe slowly. Let the whole long story cradle you, and rest deeply and peacefully, held within the great unbroken story of life. And now our long journey through the deep past comes gently to its end, and it is time to let it all go, and to drift down softly into sleep. You need not hold on to any of it now. You need not remember the names or the ages or the great events. Let them all soften and blur and fade like the last details of a landscape disappearing into the dusk. The story has been told, the journey is complete, and all that remains is rest. Feel how heavy and warm your body has become, sinking down into the soft surface beneath you, held and supported, asking nothing of you now. Feel your breathing, slow and deep and even, the gentle rise and fall, the same quiet rhythm that has carried every living creature through every night since the dawn of life. There is nothing to do now, nowhere to go, nothing to think about. The great wheel of time turns on without you, slowly and patiently, as it always has and always will, and you may set down all your cares and simply rest within it. Let the ancient world fade gently around you, the strange green forests growing dim and soft, the the great creatures settling into their own ancient rest, the endless rain, softening to the gentlest of whispers, the deep, slow turning of the patient earth, carrying you with it gently into the dark. There is no hurry here, there is no urgency, there is only the deep peace of the ancient world, the quiet of 200 million years, settling over you like the softest of blankets. You are safe, you are warm, you are held within the great unbroken story of life, the latest link in a chain that reaches back across the whole vast depth of time, carried forward on the patient river of the ages. The dinosaurs rest in their deep antiquity. The patient mammals rest in their long waiting, and you rest now too in your own quiet night, part of the same eternal rhythm, held in the same deep peace. Let the whole long story cradle you. Let the deep time carry you. Let the ancient peace fill you, soft and warm and complete. Breathe slowly, let go, and drift, gently and without fear, down into the deep and peaceful country of sleep, where the long story of life will keep its quiet watch over you through all the hours of the night. Before you drift all the way off, I would love to hear from you in the comments. If you could travel back in time and stand quietly in any one of the worlds we visited tonight, the strange dry world before the dinosaurs, the great age of endless rain, or the golden forests where the first dinosaurs rose to greatness, which world would you choose to see with your own eyes, and what would you most want to witness there? Share your thoughts whenever you wake, and let me know which ancient creature you would most like to hear a story about next. I read every comment, and your ideas help shape the stories I tell. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.